minutes. American Heritage, Bel Air, and Hawken. Are you competitors or are you observers? If you are observers, please exit the room. We just started our YouTube live stream. It looks like Mr. Jacoby just did. So if you could just go watch it on there. So that way we don't have lag issues. I know that was a big problem for one of the other chambers. While we wait, do the judges, Meg and Natalie, do you have anything you want to, paradigms you want to share to the students before we get started?
No, nothing to add other than my paradigm from before. Be an involved member of the chamber. Don't rehash arguments. Those are the most important things to me. Be respectful. That's basically it.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate the same. I think that y'all are at this point for a reason. So congratulations on your advancement this far. Good luck. Congratulations on making it through Zoom. This is a new format and really proud of y'all for making it work. So we'll just finish up today and celebrate all the results.
For sure. Okay. And then from me, overall, we had a really good round last round. I was really happy with it. Let's keep that momentum going and have one more solid round. We're going to do a quick roll call before we go any further. So just verbally say here or, raise your hand or something when I call your name. Okay, ready? Sydney Burns.
Here.
Suni Gandhi.
Here.
John Lee. John Lee.
Here.
Okay. Isaac Blackburn.
Here.
Okay. Emma Sedlak.
Here.
Awesome. Syed Fatmi.
Here.
Awesome. Isaac Slevin.
Here.
Sonali Chandi.
Here.
Rachel Pontes.
Here.
Max Rosen.
Here.
Florence Shen.
Here.
Michael Kaiser.
Here.
Caitlin Maher.
Here.
Genevieve Cox.
Here.
Elena Martinez.
Here.
Andrew Sun.
Here.
Isha Barua.
We're here.
Awesome. Looks like we have everyone. Okay, so I'm going to pass things over to your presiding officer for this round session, Syed Fatmi.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Good afternoon. I hope you guys had an amazing lunch break. I did. I know I was very hungry. Really quickly, a couple of my procedures are different, but before I do that, I have a couple questions for the parley. So, firstly, in prelims, while we were advised not to use gavel taps, we, with the discretion of the chamber, because it wasn't bothering anyone, we actually utilized them and we were better able to give signals to people. So if it's okay with the parley and at the discretion of the chamber, as well as having visual taps, is the chamber okay with audible taps? They would sound something like this, or excuse me. So it's not too loud to disturb and it shouldn't mess up with audio feedback.
Before I answer that, because I have to check in with Tab to see if they have a strong preference. Before I decide if it's even worth going to Tab, does the chamber have a preference on that?
I'm good with that.
Okay, can you thumbs up your screen if you're cool with that?
Because I know in the previous chamber, some people had a couple problems with not being able to see the signals. So I feel like having both would just benefit the chamber.
Is there anybody in the room who doesn't want to do it? Let's ask that question. I don't see anyone. Speak up now. Forever hold your peace. Okay. I'm gonna text Tab real quick. You can ask your other question while I do this.
Oh yeah, as well as that. So basically in prelims, the parley made me a co-host so that I would be able to accept amendments on a private message, because right now we can only private message a host. So if that's okay with you, would you be able to make me co-host just in case there's an amendment or something?
Done.
Perfect. And that'll allow also me for you guys, like for me to mute you guys as well. I'm gonna briefly go over my procedures. Given that tab approves, basically it'll be standard NSDA procedures. So I'll give you a 1 tap at exactly 2 minutes, 2 taps at 2 minutes 30 seconds, 3 taps at 2:55, and then I'll gavel you down from 3:05 all the way to 3:10. And I'll give you some time, but I will give you a verbal stop if you're like out of order. With that in mind, I'm also going to be giving you visual signals. So you'll get 1 finger at 2 minutes, you'll get 2 fingers at 2 minutes 30 seconds, you'll get 3 fingers at 2 minutes 55 seconds, and from 3:05 to 3:10, I'll gavel you, or excuse me, while gaveling you down, I'll also count down. Does that make sense to everyone? Awesome. I wish I had placards with like fancy names. Unfortunately, I don't have a printer. I do apologize for that. Another thing, for questioning, I'm going to be following, instead of precedence, it's a little bit different. Instead of precedence then recency, I'm just doing precedence and recency. So I'll be taking into account both when picking questioners after precedence and recency have been established. And it's just going to be straight random. I'll have my head down when I call on speakers so that when I look up, it's not like anyone who has lag, it won't interfere. I'm not looking at whoever raised their placard first. I'm just looking at a completely random, unbiased, with like through unbiased eyes. Last thing, when I'm picking questioners, in order to reduce any form of miscommunication or me picking the wrong questioner, I'll pick one questioner, and then on the chat, I will go ahead and type the names of the rest so that everyone knows the order and is able to accommodate for that. Does that work with the chamber? All right. Perfect. So we'll just wait on tab real quickly, but those are my procedures. I know it's a little bit intensive, but I want to make sure that we're able to get as much and as everything we possibly can. It is Zoom, it is online. So yeah.
Okay, Tab has just responded to me. They said if it works, that is fine. Our chamber was fortunate enough where I did not notice. I only noticed one speech where I think audio issues was a problem.
Yeah.
So I'm willing to allow it. But I do reserve the right, if at any time I notice that this chamber, that the gavel taps are starting to be inaudible for speakers because we have poor connection issues. I don't know if you guys heard, but one chamber was delayed by almost an hour because of that issue. So if that starts to become an issue for us and gavel taps no longer seem as effective, I reserve the right to pull us back to the time signals. But for now, gavel taps will be okay.
And in the case that does happen, I'll keep my fingers up until like you look at the screen so that you will know, right? I don't want like anyone going overtime because you can get penalized. It's just not a good idea. So with that in mind, is there anything the judges want to add or questions that anyone has on my procedures before we begin the debate? All right, seeing none, I now call this chamber into order at exactly 2 p.m. or for most people, 3 p.m. Are there any motions?
Motion.
Ms. Meher, or excuse me, Senator Meher.
Sorry. I move to open the floor for docket nominations.
Seconds, just hold your placard to the screen. All right, perfect. Are there any nominations? Mr. Rosen, excuse me, Senator Rosen.
I nominate docket A, consisting of libraries, protecting speakers on college campuses, and then the Hawaii bill.
Motion.
All right, Ms. Barrow, do you have a motion?
I move to close the floor for docket nominations.
Second, hold placards to the screen. All right, assuming unanimous consent, seeing we only have one docket, we will now begin debate on the libraries bill. For the judges, let me just pull it up really quickly. All right, that's gonna go. So we're now going to begin debate on a bill regulating upholding protection across U.S. Libraries Act. Is there a sponsor present? Mr. Gandhi, you're unopposed.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Gandhi, spelled Gandhi, speaking for the first time this session. As always, judges, parley, PO, any indication when you're ready, and I'll be happy to begin.
If you haven't done so, I would recommend pinning my screen so that you can see me at all times.
Got it. Judges. All right. All right. All right. Judge, where's the second judge? Okay, there we go. Cool. For nearly all of America's history, gender and sexual minorities have been asked impossible questions to an incredulous question: accept or be assimilated. But when choosing between these two suboptimal choices, this Congress has an opportunity to intervene. By passing, we give an alternative, a third option that breaks the binary. For the thousands of LGBTQ individuals, choosing between two was never a choice. And similarly, in today's debate, there isn't a binary, just progress and those who seek to undermine it. I think it's pretty clear which is which. We pass. First, let's understand the problems in the status quo. The main one is that we lack diversity in libraries. Oftentimes, because libraries are directed by local municipalities, they get to choose exactly where their funding goes. Here's the problem. Irene Travis Thompson at the University of Michigan Press explains in 2013 that there is a growing disarray of conception of LGBTQ rights. There are many people that support them, but oftentimes in many communities, there is lacking political coalition to support these individuals. There's animosity to recognizing them as valid. And a lot of communities have taken up that gender minorities are an affront to traditional and conservative American values. But the other problem is that the same public has extremely poor education on many of these issues. What happens is they often strawman. They portray their lifestyle as antagonistic to American values because there's no one else there to say, no, that's not right. This just encourages radicalization, as the New York Times explains in June of 2019. When you are surrounded by an echo chamber on a topic as politically polarizing as gay rights, it becomes much harder to change views to become more progressive. But that's where my legislation comes in. Under Section 1, we remove the abilities for states and municipalities to enact regulations restricting or censoring programs that would encourage a more open mind. You allow the meetings that I talked about to finally happen. And here's why this legislation is so critical. The American Association of School Libraries explains in 2013 that the library is the most important information source for LGBTQ individuals. Library resources can provide self-affirmation, offer characters with which to identify, and decrease feelings of alienation. When LGBTQ youth see themselves reflected positively in literature, they feel a sense of belonging and inclusion. And there's numerous benefits to this. The Journal of Social Science Research empirically proves in January of 2017 that states that institute non-discrimination laws as a result of a more progressive populace are associated with an empirical 1% decline in hate crimes. The reduction in polarization happens because of contact theory. When you meet a lot of people who don't go to the same worldview as you, you're also willing to shift your beliefs and values. For every person in this room serving in the US Senate, you have the privilege to stand in a position that gives you validity and authority. You live in a nation that puts you on a pedestal as the de jure mouthpiece of millions. But for the gender and sexual minorities in the United States, they live in a nation that makes them prove their humanity. They have to grovel for the title of person. Passing today's legislation not only helps undermine this idea, but because it is the senators in this room who should earn the right to power, not our citizens demand the right to be recognized. We affirm.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 4 seconds. We have a standard 4-block questioning period. Questioners, please rise. All right, that'll first go to Ms. Sedlak.
Can I start?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Okay, great speech, Senator Gandhi, but I'm wondering, what enforcement mechanism does today's legislation include?
Okay, so basically it's just that the federal government will no longer provide funding to these states.
How much funding does the federal government give to libraries?
So it depends a lot from state to state, but I mean, the number is greater than 0.
Not a lot though, right?
It's not a lot.
So how are we actually enforcing this legislation if libraries are losing negligible amounts of
By
money?
definition, municipalities and states have more authority over libraries. All this bill is trying to do is change the status quo and try to make some changes.
But if there's no enforcement
Representative
mechanism, how is it changing?
Okay, so
Representative Chandy.
under your legislation in Section 2C, LGBTQ minors now have to tell their parents what they're checking out of the library. Doesn't this de-incentivize them from going to the library in the first place?
That's not actually true. So it only blocks you from up to age 12. And oftentimes the attitudes you develop towards becoming becoming LGBTQ happens after the age of 12, mostly during your
Wait, no,
teenage.
isn't it around the age of 12 where they actually develop their sexual identity?
Exactly. That's
Representative Shen.
I agree that there's a lot of homophobia in the status quo, but when you enact Section 1 and allow those programs to take place, wouldn't that just out people?
No, not necessarily. Like people don't have the option to go to another library in your community. Most of the times it's just one.
Okay, so let's say this more clearly. When they're in a public setting like a library and checking out programs such as LGBTQ related things, doesn't that out them?
No, not necessarily, because again, the whole point of
Really,
this,
no one's going to see?
no, because you're not necessarily just checking.
Representative Pontes.
Representative. So in your legislation in section 1, it states that states can't enact regulation to censor. Do schools actually have rules to censor, or do they simply censor without enacting rules?
Okay, so it's a bit of both, right? Like some communities actively are against the idea of promoting these types of progressive.
Okay. So if they're actively against it, are they actually codifying it into regulation?
There's probably a few examples of where that actually happens.
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be muted. I hope that was a good trial run for everyone. Now that was a speech and affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, it'll go to Representative Slevin.
I thank the chair. Can everyone hear me all right? Awesome. My name is Representative or Senator Slevin. My pronouns are he, him, his. If I could just have a thumbs up whenever you're ready. Awesome. Great. The Family Research Council. It sounds innocuous enough. It sounds like it's just helping the lives of families across the country. But in actuality, it's a homophobic and transphobic organization that advances its interests across the country. Under today's piece of legislation, the only thing you're doing isn't just helping individuals who are LGBTQ. On net, you're actually hurting them because organizations like the Family Research Council are empowered under this piece of legislation. That's why you fail. So the first reason you fail this piece of legislation is because it hurts LGBTQ community members. This is true because it protects libraries that are teaching misinformation, and it does that in two ways. First, through Section 1. Section 1 states that states and municipalities shall not enact regulations restricting or censoring programming and resources regarding gender, sexuality, sexual identity, or family planning. Well, yes, that would apply to things like drag queen story hours and other resources for LGBTQ individuals. But what it also means is that resources that are anti-LGBTQ or resources that promote abstinence-only sexual education are also protected under Section 1 of this piece of legislation, because its vague wording of censoring programming and resources regarding a series of issues mean that homophobic and transphobic interactions can still take place and are codified under today's piece of legislation. But it does this in a second way through Section 2B, which defines censoring as the, quote, the prohibition or cancellation of any program or resource based on content. So while Drag Queen Story Hour can't be canceled, neither would presentations by individuals like the Family Research Council, meaning that homophobic and transphobic organizations have the very same right to giving presentations and sharing resources in our libraries as individuals, for example, participating in the Drag Queen Story Hours or LGBTQ authors. Under today's piece of legislation, the only thing you're doing is empowering an anti-LGBTQ agenda. That's why you fail. But let's look at the impacts on LGBTQ youth that Representative Gandhi championed in his speech. He said that LGBTQ youth will be able to see themselves in media and therefore gain access to information about their own identities. But this piece of legislation actually makes it harder for that to happen because of Section 2C, which prevents youth under the age of 12 from being able to access materials in the library. Materials aren't just books, they could be story hours or access to the internet. And under today's piece of legislation, you prevent youth under the age of 12 from accessing these vital resources. We need to pass legislation that unequivocally across the board helps LGBTQ individuals and helps our community members. I do not stand for legislation that only serves to advance the interests of people who want to promote homophobic and transphobic agendas. We should never advance these agendas within our Congress. That's why you negate.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 4 seconds. All questioners, please rise. All right, we'll start off with Representative Martinez.
So, Senator Slevin, when we censor one side, doesn't that set a precedent for the other side to be censored as well?
I mean, yeah, that's like kind of my point.
Yeah, so when we say it's okay for us to ban Christian groups, doesn't that make it okay for us to ban LGBTQ groups because it creates this precedent?
I mean, that's not quite exactly what I'm saying. I'm just saying that the vague wording in this piece of legislation means that you're protecting homophobic organizations.
But then we can also ban the groups we're trying to protect.
Representative Barua.
Thank you. I'm so glad that we're addressing the abstinence-only sexual education problem. But how do we not enforce the lack of those agendas in the status quo after this legislation?
Yeah, so there's tons of different ways we can advance a more fair sexual education, or we can advance pro-LGBTQ legislation.
Right, and when we limit resource funding to 7%, don't we actually account for that?
No, not necessarily, because as I said in my speech, when you affirm today's piece of legislation,
Representative Gandhi.
LGBT
Okay, awesome. So these groups, like the family planning organization that you talked about, right?
Yeah.
They exist in the status quo, and they are already active in the communities that are homophobic, for example. So what's the inherent harm in bringing in a countering force to the powers that are already there?
So I'm really glad you brought that up. In the status quo, if a library doesn't want a speaker, for example, if they don't want the Family Research Council to be there, they can do that. They can prevent them from speaking. But under today's piece of legislation, they're protected under Section
Representative Cox.
So if I'm a Democratic senator, do I have the right to propose a bill to this Congress in order to censor all Republican content?
I mean, you could, but it would fail.
Right, because it's against the Constitution and freedom of speech. Why is your point not contradictory to that?
Yeah, because this piece of legislation, free speech isn't everywhere. Private organizations can reduce it as they see fit. But under today's piece of legislation,
But we're not a private organization, are we? We're the government.
Thank you, representatives. You may now mute yourselves. All right, that was a speech in negation. All speakers in the affirmation, please rise. All right, between those standing, it'll go to Ms. Martinez.
I thank the chair. Good afternoon. I'm Senator Martinez speaking on the affirmation. Whenever my judges are ready, please give me a thumbs up. I'll let me know if you're not, and I'll be happy to wait. Thank you so much. Good. Great. I'm so sorry. All right. Thank you. Okay. The book 1984, an anti-communist commentary, has been banned in libraries for being too pro-communist. If anything, this contradictory perspective pays homage to the irony on which the book is based, like how war is peace. The year 1984 has long passed, but censorship has become the increasing threat that George Orwell warned us of. We must pass today's legislation. First, let's understand that freedom is slavery. Exercising our freedom to censor others strips them of their rights. Pass today's legislation because it will help immigrants. Look to Section 1, where it ensures that no library may censor a program or resources based on the criminal status of the subject. This allows for undocumented immigrants to access important information about their status and allows them to study for the citizenship test. But too often, many libraries are canceling their programs because of community dissent. In October of 2017, the Arlington Heights Library in Chicago had to cancel all of their programs helping migrants because people thought their taxpayer dollars were being spent on illegal immigrants. But that's further from the truth. Many of these programs help these immigrants gain citizenship. For example, Jennifer Oldham writes for the Pacific Standard on December 6th of 2018, talking about the program within the Denver Public Library System, which services about 1,800 people. About 60 to 70% of the immigrants that use their program reported in a survey that their financial situation was better after the programs helped them with their English and their job search. Immigrants cannot even obtain IDs because of their status, but they can obtain library cards, and that allows them to access information they never would have. Libraries are a key resource for these immigrants, and we need to ensure that their right to access this information is protected when we pass this bill. Second, we pass today's legislation to end the cycle of dissent. Ignorance is strength. Limiting our knowledge empowers unconsciousness. We need to understand why people want to cancel these programs in the first place, because there's a cycle of dissent from which they are born into which they continue to express ignorance. People aren't born ignorant. It's because they are misinformed or they're not informed at all. As Jennifer Sui-Thiel writes for the University of Wisconsin-Madison in May of 2016, explaining public libraries need to provide access to e-government and other key information so that their communities can be part of a democratic society. If people have access to information and can access both sides of a debate, they can grow from that. Senator Slevin came up here and said, we're protecting anti-LGBTQ groups, but we need to understand both sides of a topic to ensure people are educated and don't make misinformed messages. Therefore, there won't be any more dissent because we're stopping the cycle from the very beginning. Once we're lowering the age that kids can access these libraries, we're essentially stopping the cycle of ignorance by passing today's legislation. Censorship has always been an Orwellian nightmare, so let's stop it before it becomes an American reality.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. We now have standard two law questioning periods. So all questioners, please rise. Between those standing, it'll first start off with Representative Rosen.
So where in the legislation does it mention that we're going to be protecting programming for immigrants?
So it says section 1, we're going to be protecting programming that has to do with the criminal status of the subject or the author.
Wait, criminal
immigration.
Oh, so what if they aren't charged as criminals already? Because if they were, then they would probably be deported by ICE. So wouldn't that actually expose them?
No, entering the United States is a criminal offense, and they can obtain library cards without an ID often in these programs.
Right, but if they haven't yet been charged.
Thank you. Would you say that a lot of the times it's parents that champion the cause of censorship for certain books?
Yes.
So under 2C, why wouldn't parents who are concerned about potentially controversial books just not let their kids use the library?
Well, here's what's so great about Section 2C. A lot of libraries don't let children under 16 or even 18 access resources. It's lowering age in the status
and I understand that, but all I'm asking is on net, is it better to not have access to the library?
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be muted. All right, that was a speech in the affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, it'll go to Representative Cox.
Thank you. That's Representative Cox, whenever you're ready. Today's legislation is a little like President Trump's preferred cure for the coronavirus, hydroxychloroquine. It sounds really good, is a bit complicated to pronounce, but when you get into the roots, it can cause some real harm. Fail this legislation because first, it increases the online legal liability. Libraries are generally protected from liability with a couple exceptions, but this legislation's ban of censorship in Section 1 prohibits libraries from protection by these exceptions. Thomas Lipinski, professor at the University of Wisconsin, December 13th, 2019, points out that in the Communications Decency Act, they protect libraries from third-party posting liability, except in cases relating to obscenity, sex trafficking, or sexual exploitation of children. So by prohibiting censorship of, quote, any program or resource based on content, as this legislation specifies in 2B, a library is prohibited from removing material for which they are legally liable for. They are stuck in between a rock and a hard place. They either censor the content and be attacked by today's legislation and the punishments in it, or they leave the content up and be attacked by the CDA and possibly get sued for a lot of money. Senator Martinez, immigrants cannot access information about their status if their library is losing federal funding under this legislation. Senator Gandhi, LGBTQ youth cannot access information about their sexual identity and explore it if their library is fighting a massive court battle with a site like Backpage. Fail this legislation because this bill, if someone posts an ad about child pornography or transgender sex trafficking on an online library platform, they can't protect themselves and censor it. But besides the fact that this legislation creates a library liability dilemma, it also overreaches federal authority. Because in library policy, each library must have a procedure to decide which challenge material has to be banned. But this legislation interjects a federal one-size-fits-all. In Barron Books versus Sullivan, 1963, the Supreme Court held that obscenity is not constitutionally protected, but that standards differ from location to location, and only the local governments can decide what is obscene and what is not. But today's legislation takes away all local control by implementing this one-size-fits-all policy. Senator Gandhi says that by passing, communities will become more progressive, but nothing about overriding local rights makes conservative and evangelical mayors less likely to be homophobic. In fact, it only makes them even more enraged. failed today's legislation because the choice is to pay your taxes and deprive your child of library use, or to expose them to something possibly sexually inappropriate for their age or their community. We failed today's legislation because deciding what's obscene and what's a safe medicine both require processes, and today's legislation doesn't pass.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 9 seconds. Questioners, please rise. All right, between those standing, it goes to Ms. Martinez.
So you brought up the fact that a lot of these libraries are now going to have to censor content they weren't supposed to have in the first place, right?
No, I'm saying by passing this legislation, they can't censor.
They can't censor. Okay, so you're basically, so the basis for that is that this content is not supposed to be in these libraries in the first place because it's a liability. But the basis for censoring these programs is based on content, not on the legal precedent. So how does that still stand?
No, I'm saying because today's legislation says you can't censor.
Thank you, Representative Martinez. Are there any further questions? Ms. Barua.
Thank you. So on the aspect of legal liability, what did the online archive do just 1 month ago?
I'm sure you can tell me.
As a result of the coronavirus, we allowed any type of federal online archive to release their third-party content without any type of copyright claim, because we understand it's for a big social issue. Why can't we apply that same solution to this legislation?
No, but I'm not talking about copyright. In fact, what I talked about was the Communications Decency Act, which is legal liability.
So you also talked about the Digital Millennium Act, which
Thank you,
deals with
Representatives.
copyright.
Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be muted. That was a speech in negation. All speakers speaking in the affirmation, please rise. Between those standing, Representative Barua has it.
I thank the chair. That's Senator Barua, spelled B-A-R-U-A. Again, that's B-A-R-U-A. For a quick audio check, is my audio okay? I heard an echo a few minutes ago. Okay.
Ms. Barua, really quickly, I think in the last session, your audio was having a couple issues. Do you still want gavel taps, or would you just like me to give you signals?
Could you give me a signal, please?
That works.
Thank you so much. Judges, we're okay? Perfect, thank you. Like Senator Martinez, I'm a fan of literature, and as my favorite author Walt Whitman once said in his most famous work, I Hear America Singing. He says, I hear America singing, each with open mouths their strong melodious songs. But today, all I hear in this Congress is silence. Silence on an issue that is taking lives and livelihoods of people and children who don't receive the education they want because of the state of our libraries. For that state, I ask you to stand with me on the affirmation of this legislation. But first, you'll pass today's legislation to finally create an avenue for comprehensive sexual education. Now, Senator Slevin just briefly mentioned this in his speech, but let me tell you why this legislation actually solves for his concern. Because in the status quo, school districts across the nation lack comprehensive sex education since state and local governments are lobbied into banning curriculum. This isn't a result of a lack of enforcement mechanism or a lack of funding. This is clear political prejudice. But according to a report by the American Civil Liberties Union in 2017, proponents of abstinence-only curriculum force hundreds of school districts away from comprehensive sex education curriculum that has been proved to lower rates of teenage pregnancy, sexual assault, and rape. But states still have to contribute $3 matching for every dollar our federal education budget gives them. So when we pass this legislation, the combined federal and state funding that we enforce can be used for various purposes, such as media campaigns, promote programs in public schools, and most importantly, libraries. So Senator Slevin, when we give libraries the ability to run uncensored programs, they're given the freedom to actually provide kids the sexual education that our nation is missing. We give outreach that our government still can't do. This curriculum should be further managed by the individual states' congressional bodies, and that's going to actually happen with this legislation. Understand, we need to hear America singing, but their cries for help are currently going through one ear and out the other. But next, let me quickly address Senator Cox's concern about the Digital Millennium Act and legal liability. Understand that in the realm of bigger social issues, this holds no weight because we've seen as a result of the coronavirus, vast internet archives have actually been released. But next, we passed to crack down on prison library censorship. That's because we address the processes of censorship in prison libraries. According to Christopher Zukis for the Prison Legal News, in December of 2018, Texas censored so many books in their state prisons, including Women Behind Bars and How America Profits for Crime. This isn't a lack of rehabilitation alone. This is a social power structure. And we need to stop that disenfranchisement in its tracks. This legislation enables prison rehabilitation and more education for the people choking between walls of concrete in spaces the size of parking spots. We ensure that they can get their education they need and rehabilitate to our society. That's why we pass ultimately.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of exactly 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners, please rise. All right, between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Slevin.
Thank you. So if an organization under this piece of legislation wants to teach an abstinence-only agenda in a library, what is stopping them?
So the only thing stopping them now is that these political bodies in state legislatures aren't passing the curriculum that they need to
But
pass.
doesn't this piece of legislation make sure that if somebody wants to teach abstinence-only education in a library, they can?
And that's after we provide resource funding mechanisms. We limit to 7%
But if someone
of
wants
their
to be
funding that they can use
homophobic
to
in a
censor.
library, doesn't this piece of legislation protect them?
Right, it does, because they can't
Representative
be.
Kaiser.
Hi, Representative. So you said that because we're in a social crisis, these libraries don't have to worry about the liability of their resources, right?
Right, we've seen that in the terms of larger problems. It's not as much of a
Okay,
legal
so are we
issue.
supposed to declare a social emergency every time some kid wants to reach for more accessible content?
Yeah, actually, I would argue that when they want to find content that isn't available in libraries currently, that's a big priority and a big problem we need to solve.
So we're going to expect the government to declare a social
Thank
emergency.
you, Representatives. You may now be muted. That was a speech.
I thank the chair.
No problem. That was a speech and affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. All right, between all of those standing, it'll go to Representative Blackburn.
I thank the chair. If my judges could just give me a thumbs up when you guys are ready, I'll be happy to begin. Thank you. All right. PO?
Good to go. Always good.
Thank you. Both Senator Martinez and Senator Gandhi, on the affirmation, claim that communities prevent libraries from hosting programs about immigration status and LGBT issues, while Senator Slevin on the negation has talked of communities creating anti-gay presentations. But nobody on either side has explained why communities shouldn't be allowed to control their libraries. They should. And it's because first, this bill undermines the mission of a library, and second, the affirmation arguments fail that we negate. But first, we negate because this bill undermines the mission of a library, and that's because it prevents communities from deciding how the library will best serve them. John Chaska of the Library Corporation in 2020 writes that because over 90% of a library's budget is funded by property taxes on the surrounding community, the library's primary aim is to provide the services that that community wants. This is corroborated by the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction in 2016, when they write that the library's mission is to support the educational and recreational needs of the community. Now, the precise makeup of the services that the library provides is determined by the budget, which in turn is influenced by the representatives of that town, as it is the municipal body that decides on the amount of annual funds given to the library. But in Section 2A of this bill, we lock down 7% of the library budget for gender and sexuality education. This is a significant sum. Dick Kaiser of Unisphere Research in 2012 explains that the average library budget is around $2 million, and 5% of that goes to programs. So 7% of that smaller chunk is equal to about $7,000 a year. That means that if communities want to spend that $7,000 on services that it deems more useful, such as mental health programs, this bill prevents them from doing so. In fact, Marcella Cabala of the Brookings Institute in 2017 writes that 15% of library visitors in San Francisco are homeless and are making use of these mental health services that the library provides. Because this bill prevents communities from deciding how libraries should serve the community, we negate. But second, we negate because the affirmation arguments fail. Now, Senator Barra in her speech told us that we're going to be instituting comprehensive sexual education. This won't happen. The Federal Child Internet Protection Act requires libraries to block obscenity and is used by parents to enact programming restrictions related to gender and sexuality. Now, those restrictions take precedence over this bill because the Supreme Court ruled in Ginsburg v. New York that states can make laws that prioritize parental rights when it comes to objectionable material. And the court also agreed that the standard for what is objectionable belongs at the local level. The final nail in the affirmations coffin, however, is that this bill has no enforcement power. As mentioned by previous senators on my side, the only enforcement mechanism is the withholding of federal funds, but federal funds make up a tiny portion of library budgets. Educationbug.org in 2020 writes that public libraries receive 0.4% of their funding from the federal government. That has no weight in their decisions. It's because first, this bill undermines the mission of a library to serve the community, and second, the affirmation arguments fail that we negate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of exactly 3 minutes and 5 seconds. Questioners, please rise. All right, between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Martinez.
All right, so how good are libraries at listening to their community?
It's not about how good they are, it's that the community has leverage because the community decides how much budget is going to the library.
How much leverage do they have if oftentimes challenges go unreported in local libraries?
So what happens is the community's representatives make up a municipal board. That board decides how much budget's going to go to the library. So if the board wants the library to do something, they could threaten them with a cut of their budget.
What about the community members? Their challenges are going unreported.
Representative Barua.
Thank you. So you talk about the Federal Child Information Act when it comes to higher precedents for obscenity. What makes sexual education obscene?
So it's not actually that sexual education is necessarily obscene. It's that the Supreme Court ruled that parents decide what is obscene.
Right. So parents still decide with this because any patron lower than 12 years of age needs to get parental consent.
So I'm talking about the definition of obscene that allows these.
Right, but the definition in the bill also protects young children from those kinds of.
Thank you, representatives. You may now take your placards and be muted. Quick note to the chamber, I'm noticing a lack of participation in questioning. Please try and ask more questions. It'll make the round a lot more entertaining for the judges and yourselves. All right, with that being said, that was a speech in negation. All speakers in the affirmation, please rise. All right, between those standing, Representative Kaiser, you have it unopposed.
I thank the chair. Hi, everyone. That's Representative Kaiser, spelled K-A-I-S-E-R. Once again, K-A-I-S-E-R, speaking on the affirmation of today's legislation. Judges, just give me a thumbs up when you guys are ready. Good, PO, Judge Parley. All right, great. Sorry, right. Libraries are known as quiet places, and since they don't make much noise on the public scene, their importance is often overlooked. I know we hate being quiet, but our silence allows others to speak volumes. In my book, these facilities provide the resources necessary to expand education and improve resource distribution. To expand that program, you pass today's legislation. First, pass today's legislation to improve the livelihood of low-income neighborhoods by establishing a positive connection with cops and libraries. Section 2B of today's legislation outlines a specific program called Bike Cops for Kids, in which cops go to libraries, handing out treats, books, and in some cases, bikes, which attracts more children to those libraries. Arizona State University in May of 2017 explains why this is so important. Programs like Bike Cops for Kids have attracted kids to public institutions and allowed them to meet with cops in positive scenarios. Not only has this increased the trust in the police department, but it has also made kids more excited to go to libraries. Representative Blackburn, you expressed your concerns about these libraries not providing the resources necessary for their communities. But when you pass today's legislation, that's exactly what they do. The Pew Research Center in September of 2015 finds that for lower income Americans and those who are members of communities of color, libraries have a special role as places to learn new job skills, explore new digital technologies, and provide services to them or their community. When you pass today's legislation and attract kids to these libraries, you ensure that they get the resources they need to strive for success. Not only are we keeping kids off the streets by increasing trust in the police department, but we are also providing them with the educational resources they need to strive for success for generations to come. Let's flip the page on socioeconomic discrimination and start a new chapter of opportunity for low-income Americans. But next, understand that today's legislation improves relationships between parents and kids by incentivizing children to have an open dialogue with their parents. Because Representative Gandhi tells us that today's legislation attracts more kids to libraries because of that diversified content. But Representative Slevin expresses his concern that this might cause LGBTQ and pro-abstinence groups to have more resources there. But let's understand why that point falls. Its warrant is that that is the only education that kids are going to get. But that's not true, because Section 2C of today's legislation prohibits children who are under the age of 12 to go to the library without parental consent, which incentivizes a conversation between kids and their parents. The Atlantic explains in 2019 that this conversation about sex, drugs, and mental health builds the relationship between parents and children, ensuring that the families back the support of the children. When you pass today's legislation, you ensure that parents communicate with their kids and accept them for who they are. But more importantly, the benefits of today's legislation go far beyond any textbook. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 7 seconds. Questioners, please rise. All right, between those standing, Representative Lee has it first.
Don't you think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that restricting people less than younger than age of 12 makes it so that they have more sexual education talks? Like, where's the link?
Okay, all I'm saying is that, like Senator Gandhi told us, more people are attracted to these libraries because of diversified content. That sparks a conversation between younger children and their parents about graphic content.
Why?
Because when these kids ask to go to the libraries and the parents ask why,
it's not like
the
these
kids are going
people
to
are
tell
like
them that it's for the
intentionally
diversified
looking for
content.
sexual education content. It's not, they're not targeting it.
Representative Burns.
Hi, Senator. I'm really confused. You say that we will be incentivizing conversation between parents and children, but why is this such a good thing when LGBTQ can have homophobic parents and they go off on their children?
Okay, because here's the thing, right? When we incentivize that conversation, we start acceptance at an earlier age. But not only that,
where's the link between
but not
acceptance
only that, when we pass today's legislation, we ensure that kids above 12 years old have the resources to explore all the information they need at these libraries. So even if their parents are homophobic, we're still helping them.
But at the age
Thank you, Representatives. Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be muted. All right, that was a speech in the affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, Representative Shen.
Hi everyone, that's Senator Shen, spelled S-H-E-N, just like my placard. Whenever you're ready, thumbs up would be great. Thank you, thank you. Everyone's good? Okay, I'll just pin my PO and all good. Sorry, 1 second. Cool. Throughout the last 4 years, minorities from all backgrounds have been under regressive discrimination. We as a Congress should be asking ourselves, how does that happen when we were on the track for progress? With the unfortunate past as precedent, take caution when proposing legislation. Don't make the current situation even worse. For that reason, you fail. First, fail to protect identities. Let's take the affirmation at their highest ground and assume that only progressive and helpful programs will be allowed from Section 1. Even then, one essential factor is left out, the fact that libraries are very much so public. Senator Martinez, you argue passing decreases dissent, but when you risk people to be found out in non-private settings, passing only increases conflict. Not only is it connected to their communities, especially in neighborhoods that tend to be the least tolerant, such as religious and rural communities, it's one of the least private ways for people to access sensitive programs and resources. There's 2 scenarios for that. First, people who feel the need to enter libraries will choose not to go in fear of being outed, undermining the purpose of this regulation. The Public Library Association reports on March 14th of 2017, when 80% of the students who came from liberal low-income regions were violently abused, it decreased attendance in local libraries by 77%. But the second is that the public setting only increases the chance that someone finds out about their identity. That's very dangerous. The Human Rights Council tells us on April of 2019, 47,000 people were physically abused by others who disagreed with the idea of gender, sexuality, and sexual identity. You only increase that risk when you put programs that are in such public settings under the status quo. Senator Gandhi champions in his speech that passing finally helps LGBTQ youth through less censorship. I agree with that principle, but when it's done in a risky public setting, we have to find another way. For the author who created books for us to enjoy, their fantasy is hardly a reason to ignore reality.
But second, fail to protect telecommunication. Senators Blackburn and Cox on my own side explain in their speeches how Section 2A takes away 7% of libraries' profits, causing cuts in funding to libraries. Why is that especially harmful? Senator Kaiser explains how it helps low-income communities by bettering relations and increasing attendance. But when libraries are losing $7,000 a year, that flips your impact. The US Library Program tells us on September of 2015, without any place to go to learn the information necessary for tests, it decreased graduation and students who use libraries by 15%. When they have to cut their budgets for telecom, when they no longer have the money, that is the most dangerous thing and why you fail.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Gandhi.
Hi. So let's talk about your public setting argument, right? I agree that if you're checking out books in public, that can expose you. But can resources also include things like ebooks or digital media resources that you can access privately?
Yeah, here's the problem with that. Section 2C says that a library patient has to be the parent of a child, especially if they're really young, right? That's just equally as dangerous.
Right, but when does the average child develop their sexuality?
I wouldn't say that there's an average. I think it's different for everyone.
Okay,
I
but
mean,
approximately, would you argue that it's prepubescent or when you start to become a teenager?
I mean,
Representative Cox.
is saying that.
Hey, so after we pass today's legislation, what are the real odds that someone is going to be outed on a computer in a library?
I would say it's very possible considering it's literally in a public setting where people come together to stay.
But you give a lot of statistics about how many, how bad disagreeing with someone on sexual identity can be, but you never give a statistic about how often that happens in libraries.
Right. I can't possibly give you that statistic because it's centered in the state.
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be muted. All right, that was a speech in negation. Speakers in the affirmation, please rise. Representative Chandy, you're unopposed.
I thank the chair. That's Representative Chandy, spelled Chandy. Just give me a smile or nod whenever you're ready. Just give me a little bit to set up, please.
Yeah.
Good. Are we good? Judges? Good. Okay. As we've established in this round, most public libraries are funded by some combination of local, private, state, and federal money in the forms of taxes, fees, grants, and donations. But that doesn't mean that they should have any say in what happens in a library. Throughout this debate, we've weighed two different sides, but at the end of the day, you're going to realize one thing: the affirmation will always win. First, pass today's legislation, because currently, community standards may take into account deciding if materials are subject to censorship. According to the Middle Tennessee State University, although censorship violates the First Amendment right to freedom of speech, some limitations are constitutionally permissible. The courts have told public officials that at all levels, they may take into account community standards in making decisions, but that's actually a problem. In the state of Missouri, a bill called the Parental Oversight of Public Libraries Act was being passed, according to CNN in January of 2020. The bill would cut off state aid to any public library that allows minors to access age-inappropriate sexual materials. The board would decide what materials it considers inappropriate and hold hearings to take suggestions from the public. It would have the power to remove materials considered inappropriate from public access by minors. The reason why this bill was able to be passed is because it ensured that the community had some say in it and had some consent in the decisions that happened in the library. Now, even if parental boards were to block homophobic content, yes, it would still end up in libraries, but we can actually pass that. We can actually pass today's legislation and change that. Mr. Blackburn tells us that if you fund a library, you should have a say in the decisions that are being made. But that ignores all the boards that are homophobic towards LGBTQ populations. Today's bill ultimately prioritizes one thing, and that's education. And that's why we pass. But second, pass today's legislation because there are already enough resources for the young LGBTQ population under the age of 12. Public schools and libraries in the United States have the ability to limit children's choices of books to read. The problem highlights the tension between parental authority and society, but standing on the negation only furthers that problem.
All the senators in the negation have talked about Section 2C of the legislation, where kids under the age of 12 have to talk to their parents about what they're checking out at the library. But they ignore one thing, that there are more resources than just libraries that give them information. In fact, according to the Pew Research Center in August of 2009, among 12 and 13-year-olds, already 52% of them have cell phones in 2008. Even if today's legislation doesn't allow those groups of kids to go to the library, they still have other methods of getting information. At the end of the day, you're going to prioritize one thing, education, and that's why you passed today's legislation.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 2 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Between those standing, Representative Blackburn.
Okay, so if a school board opposes not a school board, a library board opposes the normalization of drag queens, why is their opinion invalid?
Okay, so I'm not saying that their opinion is invalid, but I'm saying that actually hurts some of the population right now.
Right, but why does that disqualify them from having a say in how the services their library?
Because they're hurting the LGBTQ population.
So you're mandating that the obligation of libraries is to support the LGBT community?
I wouldn't mandate it, but in some geographic locations,
that's actually what this bill does, though.
Few resources for those.
Representative Meher.
Representative, so what happens when these libraries actually are going to be no longer having these restrictions? What are parents going to do about it?
I don't really know what you're where you're
in the status quo. When these libraries don't have these restrictions, parents take it upon themselves to eliminate the books from the library through sort of covert taking down.
And I brought about the solution about actually giving education to the community, not just the kids, but also the community.
But giving education to the community doesn't stop.
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be muted. Representative Burns, do you have a motion or an inquiry?
I rise to a point of personal privilege.
Take that privilege.
To exit the chamber.
Go for it. You're allowed back in. Just unmute yourself. For future reference, just in case you need to do that, just go ahead and type it out in the chat and just say it. It just makes it easier. Ms. Meher, do you have an inquiry?
Yeah, just a point of order. I believe I've had questioning precedents the last two times, both over Mr. Blackburn and over the previous person in both of the previous questioning cycles. So I just wanted to point that out.
Oh, I apologize. I probably didn't see you. That was my first time seeing you. So yeah, that was probably my fault. All right, that was a speech in affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. Between those, Ms. Meher, you have it.
I thank the chair. Give me one moment, please, everyone. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. For my judges, that is Senator Maher, spelled M-A-H-E-R, speaking for the first time in this legislative session. I'm always at your leisure, so just a smile or nod whenever you're ready would be awesome. Great, fantastic, and one more. Are all the judges good? Okay, got it. Thank you. I'm just setting up my timer. Growing up, my favorite childhood movies included the likes of Beauty and the Beast, The Frog Prince, and Finding Nemo. But what I didn't realize until I got a little bit older was that Beauty and the Beast was a paean to bestiality. The Frog Prince contains a slimy interspecies embrace, and Finding Nemo is a glorified fish trafficking story. Today, this Congress is given the delightful job of categorizing them. Would these fairy tales be stuck in the restriction section? Do they portray negative themes of sexuality, sexual identity, and gender? And while some might call them merely innocuous fairy tales, others might believe that they embrace themes that don't quite pass the trial test. But understand that under today's legislation, affirmation senators such as affirmation senators such as Mr. Gandhi, Ms. Martinez, Ms. Barua, and Mr. Kaiser all champion their advocacy as a way of entirely eliminating all restrictions, understand that you only actually leave it up to those who are the most biased. Because today's legislation entrusts a flawed organization to entrust all of these determinations. First, you fail today's legislation because the enforcement mechanism is entirely fractured. Now, I'd like to distance myself from Senator Blackburn on this, who essentially tells you that the libraries in the United States don't get any funding. That's actually not true. Not true. Section 3 of today's legislation stipulates that the director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services shall enforce the legislation, but understand that there is a chronic lack of funding in the 2020 federal budget, because in President Trump's 2020 federal budget, he drastically cut library budgets 98% and even sought to eliminate the very organization that we have regulating this entire piece of legislation. Now, that last part obviously didn't end up happening, but it simply shows a lack of support from the executive concerning libraries. The impact of that is that it is utterly impossible for a single underfunded institution to adequately oversee the 116,867 libraries in the United States. But moreover, under 20 U.S. Code Chapter 9103 subsection A, which is referred to under Section 3 of today's legislation, the director of the IMLS is appointed by the president. Understand how our president's blatantly homophobic, sexist, and racist tendencies have the opportunity to permeate this very regulatory system. So Representatives Martinez and Representative Barua, instances like the ones you're talking about will slip through the cracks because of xenophobia within our administration. But then second, you fail today's legislation because a lack of enforcement mechanism extends locally. The Office for Intellectual Freedom of the American Libraries Association notes that the biggest way that books are removed are actually from parents, community members, or even librarians who quietly remove them from the shelves. This form of stealth censorship isn't solved for in either world. And because it can't be monitored, that's going to be exactly what's going to start happening. Today's legislation provides a perverse incentive for more parents and guardians who oppose content to simply remove them on their own at increasing rates instead of actually having a protest, as is in the case in the status quo. For thousands of LGBTQ plus individuals across the nation, this bill is no fairy tale. Negate.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners, please rise. All right, between those standing, Representative Chandi will have the first question.
Hi, Senator. So if you're talking about how there's not that much of a federal budget, why can't states just raise their taxes?
Okay, first, I think that states should be raising their taxes and a bunch of other things, and I don't think that necessarily it's stipulated in this legislation that that would be what they would actually be raising their taxes for. You would need to provide an alternative for why these states would want to raise taxes on their already struggling constituents, especially in the COVID era.
States already fund these public libraries, right?
Yes, I understand that, but people are literally losing their jobs all across this nation. This Library Act cannot be states' first priority.
Representative Rosen.
Sorry, I was muted. Regarding your first point, doesn't this actually put a check on President Trump's anti-LGBTQ stances by mandating that libraries be allowed to continue with these programs?
Sure, if that's the way you look at it. But the way I look at it, the very director of the program who is going to be regulating and enforcing these different instances of violations is literally a part and subject to a partisan administration. That means that
Wait, is this an independent agency or is it a cabinet position?
No, I told you that under US code, the director of the IMLS is appointed by the
Who
president.
says that the director of the
Thank you,
IMUS
Representative.
is a
Due to
Republican?
lack of time, you may now take your placards and be seated.
I think the chair.
No problem. Really quickly, there's an extra screen on this call, and it's hindering my ability to see everyone. Would the parley know what that is?
Yep, I was actually just about to address that. Thank you for bringing it up. To the user Desert Vista High School, it looks like you're an observer. Please exit this and go into the YouTube live stream. For future reference, I'll just be removing observers that jump in. But since this is the first time it's happened in this session, I just wanted to give the warning. So could you move to the YouTube live stream? You'll be able to see all the same thing, and it doesn't slow the round at all. So I'll give you like 30 seconds to leave.
While that's happening, to address the previous point of order, Ms. Mayor, you actually had the same precedence as Mr. Blackburn, and I do apologize for not seeing you earlier. I was having the same problem as before, where I couldn't see everyone, but I didn't realize it. So from now on, I'll keep track. Did they leave? All right, perfect. With that being said, that was a speech in negation. So all speakers in the affirmation, please rise. Representative Sun, you're unopposed.
Thank you.
That's
Senator Sun.
Yes, Representative Kaiser?
So for points of personal privilege, can we just type it in the chat?
Yeah, I think it's just easier. You're not disturbing anyone.
Okay, sorry, thank you.
Once again, that's Sun, S-U-N, first time today on the affirmative this time. If sound and everything is good, judges, PO, parley, whenever you're ready, I'll be happy to begin. Awesome. Everyone good. The core values surrounding today's debate have exactly to do with why we are gathered here on Zoom today. First, to engage in discourse that is necessary for our constituents and adequate representation. And second, as an educational activity in congressional debate. When you finally weigh today's debate through two values of discourse and education, you'll see that the affirmative has clearly emerged victorious. First, we have to take a bigger look at discourse when it comes to today's debate, because there was a clash between Senator Gandhi and Senator Slevin at the beginning of today's debate, where Senator Gandhi tells you that you should pass today's bill to increase diversity, and Senator Slevin tells you that today's legislation removes our ability to censor anti-LGBT misinformation. I would like to merge these two arguments together and argue that the fact that people now receive multiple streams of information under an affirmative world is the most important impact in today's debate, because it has everything to do with why libraries are going to exist in the future. Ryan Holmes explains in 2018 for Forbes that libraries are reinventing themselves as centers of discourse. A job of a librarian goes well beyond checking out books. The most important part of that job is information literacy, the ability for people to evaluate information critically and see both sides in a debate. The American Library Association backs this with Supreme Court precedents, where the Supreme Court ruled that a prerequisite to the freedom of speech is the ability to receive different streams of information, and as a result, publication. Status quo instances of censorship run contrary to this very value of discourse, and I am sick and tired of this Congress acting so hypocritical about it. Mitchell Kings explains in 2017 that libraries are often used as community centers, often for the LGBT community to support each other. So to answer the question Senator Cox was concerned about in cross-examination, that's what libraries should be, and that's the closest we'll get if we pass today's piece of legislation versus the inaction of the negative. Next, let's talk more about education. The only response to this from the negative comes from Senator Blackburn, who tells you that sexual education is obscene, but he completely ignores Section 1's emphasis on family planning, which I'm surprised no one in this debate has mentioned. Planned Parenthood explains that family parent is the reason that there was a 1/3 wage gain for women since the 1960s, because of more literacy about what to do with your family planning. This is incredibly crucial when it comes to the value of education. The last thing we can do is fail today's legislation, allow censorship and restriction to still happen, and stifle the educational needs of our constituents. Value, the two values of discourse and education. Why we are here today. Pass today's bill.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. Questioners, please rise. All right, give me 1 second to switch my screen so I get everyone. But with those, Representative Sedlak has the first question.
Hi, Senator Sun. I'm still missing how today's legislation has any enforcement mechanism.
So we just passed the CARES Act, which granted an additional $50 million toward libraries. That would be the enforcement mechanism.
So we would be taking away that money if we
We're
were
not
to pass
taking
this
it away.
legislation.
The leverage would be enough for libraries to comply under today's bill, especially with Senator Slevin's point.
No, what I mean is that if a library tried to ban a book, we would now be taking away that funding.
No, not if they ban a book. If they restrict it to less than 7%, which is reasonable given Senator Slevin's argument on your own side that both sides of discourse.
Yes, but what is the longevity of this policy?
Hi, Senator. Let's assume discourse increases. What's more likely, a librarian convincing a highly homophobic parent to suddenly be accepting, or just further anger and tensions?
I'm not trying to argue that today's bill is some magic solution to homophobia. I'm rather trying to argue that it's the step towards creating multiple
So you
streams
would
of
rather
discourse.
public argumentation and further tensions and
Discourse is how you can actually resolve issues. That's the prerequisite.
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be muted. All right, that was a speech in the affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, it'll go to Representative Pontes.
Thank you. This is Representative Pontes speaking for the first time today, of course. Just give me a big thumbs up when you're ready, and I'd be happy to begin. For most children growing up, the wizarding books in the Harry Potter series were a favorite. It turns out that it was actually one of the most censored books for years, with Catholic schools citing the conjuring of evil spirits as the reason. Just as ridiculous, this bill isn't the magical solution to the problem. It's a restrictive power exercised by Congress. First, stand with me in the negation because no school enacts regulation. Every single senator has come up here today with misconceptions about what this legislation does. There is a difference between formally restricting these resources and just having certain books in their library. Look at Section 1 of the legislation. It prohibits states and municipalities from enacting regulation to censor and restrict. The key words here are enact regulation. The American Library Association and their selection criteria tell us that libraries don't enact regulation of what they do or don't include. They simply carry out that action. Senator Gandhi, Kaiser, and Perea, the reason this discrimination exists in content in libraries is because libraries and schools simply don't order books that don't align with their values. It is not because of regulation passed in these schools. But second, even if you take the affirmative at their highest ground and ignore this legislative error, this still stands to harm specialized libraries. The American Library Association tells us that a special library provides specialized information resources on a particular subject and serves a limited clientele. Now, these libraries can exist in schools and universities, like law or medical school libraries, so they qualify under this legislation as state or municipal libraries. These libraries serve an extremely niche group of people, and they often don't have diversity of resources. The result of passing today's legislation either forces special libraries to lose their niche status and lose access to grants. The Institute of Museum and Library Services on January of 2020 tells us that each year, the Institute offers over 1,500 grants that special libraries can apply for and access. Senator Gandhi and Slavic, I will always be the strongest advocate for diversity and representation for minorities. But the very point of these libraries is to be specialized. You can enact regulation to help promote these materials, but you don't enact blanket policy that takes away materials from people that need it, medical research areas. The wand this Congress holds is to act fairly. Thousands of schools took away Harry Potter for misconceived notions. This Congress seeks to take away so much more.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Sun.
Thank you. I want to ask how your two arguments in your speech interact. If there's no enforcement to today's bill, how does it hurt specialized libraries?
Okay, so I'm arguing that there's an extreme legislative error in the bill, but even if you amend that bill or you take the affirmation at their highest ground, it's still bad for
So
specialized
I understand
libraries.
there's an even if, but which one do you think is more likely to be true?
The first one, it's an extreme legislative
So then
error.
what's the harm of the bill?
The harm of the bill is it like literally
What's the harm
doesn't
of
do
the bill?
anything.
That's not a harm.
But the bill doesn't do anything. Why would you pass it?
The previous line of questioning, right? Like oftentimes in Congress, we're used to making reactive policy. What's the harm in making proactive policy like this one right now? If you say that nothing is going to
Because
change.
no schools are going to enact regulation saying we're going to censor or restrict the materials of this group.
What's the harm in creating the precedent that you can't do this, even if no one's doing it right now, just to ensure that no one does it in the future?
Because no schools are moving in that direction. There's no reason they would expose
Thank you,
themselves to that.
Representative. Due to a lack of time, you may not take your placards and be muted. That was a speech in negation. All speakers in the affirmation, please rise. I'll ask again, all speakers in the affirmation. Seeing none, I highly frown upon a one-sided debate, but all speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, it'll go to Representative Lee.
Hi, I'm Senator Lee speaking on the negation, probably for the last time today. Please give me any indication when you're ready and I'll be sure to begin. Second, start my timer. All right. There's a big difference between fighting censorship and suppressing free choice in this country. This bill really blurs the difference between the two, and it really unfairly puts regulations upon our libraries, and it does it in a way that's not even enforceable. Now let's go into my 2 points why you should stand in the negation. Because first of all, it suppresses free choice, and second, because patron satisfaction drives donations. So let's go on to my first point. Now, first off, it's just as Senator Blackburn said in his speech. We're seeing that libraries spend barely anything on their books and materials. Because the February 1st, 2017 Library Journal report points out that libraries only spend about 10% of government funding on materials and programming. Now, Section 2A of this bill also makes it so that we spend only 7% of that, meaning that there's less money to spend for other objects or other programs. But here's a new analysis that no one else in this chamber really brought up. We're seeing that patrons are able to order what they want from these librarians. Now, a May 2019 College and Research Libraries report writes that about 90% of libraries institute a patron/demand-driven acquisition policy. Basically, what this is saying is that librarians are asking their patrons, what do you want and what kind of material interests you? And so then these patrons are able to request certain types of materials and books, meaning that they're able to pick what kind of materials that the library gets. Meaning that it's not just the librarians who are able to pick what kind of materials presented in these libraries. You have to see that also the patrons have a part in picking which kind of materials are a part of these communities. And so by passing this bill, we're spending less money, or we have less money to spend in demand for these books, because now we're basically limiting all of their choice, because now we're spending less money for able thing that they can actually pick. And so that's a really big harm, because as Senator Gandhi and Sun said, basically every affirmation speaker, they're all saying that basically libraries are currently restricting free speech or something, but that's not true. Because if people in the community really want to talk about LGBTQ issues or social health issues, all they have to do is actually just request it from their librarians, and then it will become passed. That's the entire point of these librarian acquisition policies. I've just showed you that 90% of them actually have those kind of policies in place. But why does patron satisfaction matter? And why does that impact those librarians in the first place? Well, this goes on to my second point, because patron satisfaction drives donations inside of libraries. A February 16th, 2018 Library Journal article writes that materials and programming are top benefactors of donations, meaning that patrons who are satisfied and patrons who get what they want in their libraries are more likely to actually donate for materials and for technology. Meaning that these things are basically correlated with satisfaction and money. Meaning that if libraries satisfy their patrons, they get more money. It's just as Senator Blackburn said, the purpose of a library is to contribute to the community. And by serving your community, you get more donations from your community. And that's really important because according to a January 22nd, 2019 Library Corporation report, we see that in almost every single state, local funding accounts for over 90% of the total funds of a library. We have to see that donations make up a major portion of these funds. And also, if you pass this bill, you're censoring their free speech or free choice because now they have less money to spend on the books that they want. If you pass this bill, you completely sacrifice choice for the sake of ineffective policy. Mr. Blackburn told you 0.5% of federal funding is given to libraries. That is not an enforcement mechanism. There is no incentive for them to pass this bill. That's why you have to fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 6 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Kaiser.
Hi, Representative. So really
Hi.
quick, who's more likely to make a donation? Someone with high income or low income?
Probably high income.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is when you satisfy the needs of the high income people, you represent them in libraries. But what about the low income citizens? How are they getting their needs represented?
It's not just high income people that are able to request librarians for materials. Everyone in the community, including low income constituents,
So
are able.
when's the last time you got a survey in your mailbox asking what you want at your local library?
Well, they go to the library and then they ask for what they want.
Representative Cox.
Okay, so the people who use the library can request things, but they can't tell the library to restrict things because that's not their place. So
Yeah.
what's the harm in passing today's legislation and just letting everything not be censored?
Okay, so the harm is we have limited funds in the status quo to buy books, right?
You have limited
7%.
funds. You have 7% to restrict.
Yeah, 7% to restrict. You have to spend at least 7% of it. That means 91% of it, you're basically putting a 10% decrease in the funds you're able to buy books that people want.
But that's only if the person requests it, right? Like, what's the problem?
So I'm saying that it's a benefit. If you really want.
Due to a lack of time, you may not take your placards and be muted. That was a speech in negation, or excuse me, that was a speech in negation. All speakers in the affirmation, please rise. A note to the chamber: if we don't have any, we are forced to move the previous question. Seeing none, unfortunately, we will be moving the previous question. So all those in favor of passing this legislation, go ahead and hold your placards to your screen. All right, that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All those that wish to negate, please go ahead and hold your placards to the screen. That'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Abstentions? That'll be 1. On a vote of 7 to 8 to 1, this legislation does fail.
Motion.
Before there are any motions, if we want to allow everyone to get 2 speeches at least, we probably should not take any recesses. With that in mind, is there a motion?
Excuse me.
Yes.
First off, we're not going to get everybody. We're just not going to be able to get everybody 2 speeches with 2.5 hours. Second, judges, Meg, Natalie, do you guys want a break at all to use the restroom, get some water? Do you guys want a break for any reason, like 5 minutes?
I'm okay. I'll follow whatever the chamber wants to do.
Okay.
Can I get 2 minutes?
All right, I'll just go ahead and call for a motion for a recess. Representative
Motion. A motion for a 5-minute recess.
Seconds. Placards. All right, assuming unanimous consent, we'll now have a 5-minute recess. Please reconvene at 3:18. Or excuse me, 4:18 for you guys.
Syed.
Yes.
Can you private message me on here, please?
Yeah. All right, everyone, we have about 30 seconds left, so please go ahead and start reconvening. Also, Representative Kaiser, if you could go ahead and rename yourself to participant Michael Kaiser or Mikkel Kaiser, it would help tab.
Hi, sorry, it must have changed when I joined back.
Yeah, all good. Just waiting on 2 people. We're waiting on Representative Blackburn. We have quorum. Parley, should I just begin?
Darn mute. My bad. Yeah, for sure. Begin.
All right, I call this chamber back into order at 4:18 p.m. We're now going to begin debate on the speakers bill, which is, for the judges, a bill to protect controversial speakers at higher education institutions. Is there a sponsor present? Representative Lee, you're unopposed.
Thank the chair. I'm Senator Lee, speaking twice in a row. I'm on the affirmation. Please give me any indication when you're ready, and I'll be sure to begin. Great. PO ready?
Yeah.
In America, freedom of speech is a right, but it's often seen that this is becoming an inconvenience to colleges rather than something that should be protected by the Constitution. We as Americans and we as constituents of this great country have to understand that free speech comes with a cost, but that cost is always worth the price. Stand in the affirmation for 2 reasons. First, because the threat of violence is currently grounds for cancellation, and second, because it's a bipartisan issue. So first, pass this bill because basically it's been Supreme Court backed that this is a really big issue in the United States. Because Feiner versus New York in 1951, basically what happened is in 1949, a man named Irving Feiner went against racism. And he went to a public area and he rallied against racism. And he basically fought against some of the public figures in this time. And so we saw that a big crowd surrounded him. And then there was a lot of ruckus and a lot of riots happening. And so the police came in and they got involved. But rather than arresting the people who were causing the riots, they actually arrested Feiner, the person who's exercising his right to free speech in the first place. We're seeing that in the status quo, people who are going against using their free speech are actually being targeted in the system. And we saw that when that got brought to the Supreme Court actually upheld his conviction 6-3. Because in the status quo, we see a really big issue with freedom of speech. Now, according to an April 2017 Freedom Forum Institute report, this phenomenon is called the heckler's veto, where basically a speaker's right is being canceled and it's being suppressed by the fear of basically disruption. This is being played by a lot of colleges in the United States. It's being played by a lot of universities when people of controversial status come in and they basically say things that not everyone in the university might agree with. Because it takes one person or one heckler to go up and threaten basically or cause a ruckus. And that basically suppresses the person's right to free speech. And basically by passing this bill in section 1, we investigate this kind of actions happening. We stop it from happening in the future. A task force is going to be amended, and we're going to make it so that any instances of free speech violations will be prevented in the future, and that America actually cares about free speech in the future. Now, this goes to my second point, because in the status quo, we see this is a really bipartisan issue. On both sides of the aisle, right or left, we see that free speech is being suppressed. So when you pass this bill, you take the first step towards enabling better free speech for all Americans. Now, September 18th of 2015, the Index on Censorship basically writes that in the 1950s, we saw a lot of censorship in terms of communism. The McCarthyan era basically suppressed everyone who tried to talk about communism or socialism at all. And so we see that basically in those times, America had a really big history of free speech, suppression. And so basically, if we pass this bill, we make sure that we set a precedent, because right now in history, it's been lined by a lot of free speech suppression. And so by taking a first step in this bill, we finally make sure that America cares about free speech. Now, January 5th, 2020, National Coalition Against Censorship also follows up. It states that America has had a long history of media censorship and it's been pressing obscenity charges on the artists since 1990s. It's been pressuring removal of songs from albums. And America has just been taking a really strong stance against freedom of speech. It's really ironic when in the Constitution, we say that free speech is a given right, but then we take that right away when it serves the convenience of us. Basically, with this bill, we make sure that all universities, all places of higher education actually respect that right. We make it so that America prioritizes free speech. Pass.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 11 seconds. Questioners, please rise. All right, it'll first go to Representative Pontes.
Representative, so who appointed the Attorney General?
The president.
Okay, and has he exhibited partisanship towards Republicans?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you call this a bipartisan issue, why do you put the Attorney General in charge of appointing the task force?
Because you're only focusing on the current administration. This is a bipartisan issue because this bill is extended past the current administration. It's going to happen for Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. It's going to happen for a long time.
But why do you put the Attorney General in charge of appointing the task force, and then you put a...
Hi,
not just-
thank you. So in the status quo, who decides what is free speech and what isn't?
Government, Supreme
Well,
Court.
yeah, so it's the court system, right?
Yeah.
So why would the court system want appointed individuals to decide what free speech is and what isn't?
Okay, so basically what this is doing is making sure that given the definition from the Supreme Court, we make sure that people in America,
Doesn't this piece of
especially higher
legislation
education,
that we have to follow what the Supreme Court says. Doesn't this set
because you just said it yourself, that's
Representative
defined by the
Blackburn.
Supreme Court.
Representative Blackburn.
Okay, so a school in violation of this bill forfeits all funding it receives instantly, right?
Excuse me, sorry, could you say that again?
So a school in violation of this bill forfeits
Yeah.
all funds it receives, right?
Yeah.
So what's the process for them to get those funds back?
I mean, I think that if you make a violation, this is just standard executory protocol. I mean, you can just request the next fiscal year. I don't see the problem.
Do they get them back immediately after?
Representative Maher.
They can request it again.
Oh,
Yes?
just a question. When Betsy DeVos and William Barr, two of the most adamant conservatives on Capitol Hill, are literally appointing the members to determine the violations, how can you say this will be bipartisan in any way?
Because, like I said, this is an issue that extends past this current administration.
but
Even if it's
our
partisan for now, they can replace the
our
next administration.
Is adamant upon censorship and is
Okay.
adamant upon
The current administration is incentivized not to make it partisan because he knows that if he makes it partisan, the next
Representative.
administration will also make it partisan.
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you may not be muted. That was a speech in the affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, I believe Representative Rosen has not yet spoken.
Thank the chair. Yes, that's right. This is Senator Rosen speaking for the first time this session. I'm just going to pin the PO, and if the PO could let me know if everyone's ready, that would be great.
I think the judges are ready to go as well.
Awesome. Great. From conservative activist Ben Shapiro to liberal activist Jason Riley, speakers of all political backgrounds are being censored. This is truly an issue spread across all party lines. That's why we need a bipartisan solution. But today's legislation mixes partisan politics with our Bill of Rights. Make sure you protect what's in this Constitution, that you don't allow the First Amendment to be eroded. But under this legislation, you do exactly that. The core of this legislation is the task force. The question in today's debate is this task force going to be effective, and is it going to be impartial? The answer to both of those is simply no. Senator Lee continues to say in questioning that actually, because this is a bipartisan issue, therefore the task force will be bipartisan. But he couldn't be further from the truth, because as Section 2 says, the Attorney General and the Secretary of Education get to each appoint 9 members. Keep in mind that both of those positions were appointed by President Trump or whoever the president will be in years from now. And as Inside Higher Education says in February of 2020, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos has already been able to appoint members to numerous task forces. One of them is the most recent Education Coronavirus Task Force, which, by the way, doesn't include one Democrat and already is pushing forward with Republican support for more funding for charter schools and less funding for Title IV schools. But what about Attorney General Barr? Is he going to be as biased with his 9 appointees that he gets with this bill? The answer is yes. As the Department of Justice says in January of 2020, Attorney General William Barr has appointed numerous members to task forces ranging from criminal justice to law enforcement. His most recent task force has 16 people to push for criminal justice reform, which, by the way, includes all Republicans, not one Democrat. And what they're pushing for are policies universally opposed by Democrats, like more funding for private prisons. But maybe you're thinking that if we have a Biden administration or a Democrat administration, whatever it may be, that bias won't exist. You still are incorrect. The Education Writers Association says in January of 2017 that both the Attorney General and Secretary of Education under the Obama administration also got to appoint members to numerous task forces, ranging from educational reform to criminal justice. And nearly all appointees, when you look at the archives, are Democratic lawmakers or lobbyists or party members. And they all pushed for policies that even had people like Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney voicing their disapproval. Clearly, task forces with presidential appointees appointing members to the task force are inherently biased. Here's why that's a problem. If a Democrat is censored by conservative students or vice versa, if that task force is completely full of GOP lawmakers and lobbyists, who do you think they're going to root for? Who are they going to side for? They're not going to support Democrat speakers who have been silenced like Jason Riley and Anita Alvarez and numerous other examples. And Senator Lee, you said that the Supreme Court wants to protect speech, so we should follow their lead. Again, look at the Constitution. The Supreme Court is built to be nonpartisan, but Congress and the task forces always quabble with each other and have disagreements. That will continue to happen. Keep politics and the Bill of Rights separate. Negate this legislation.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 9 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Between all of those standing, it'll first go to Representative Lee.
So don't you think there will be some compromise by a Republican administration, for example, to appoint some Democratic or some moderate people on the board, just so that in future administrations, they know that they still have their concerns addressed as well?
I really wish that you were right, but looking at numerous examples of precedent from the Justice Department to the Education Department, that's just not the case.
Okay, moving on. Like, how objective is free speech? Like, I'm pretty sure First Amendment rights aren't that like subject to like.
Well, actually, it's very subjective because, for example, Jason Riley and Anita Alvarez is a former Illinois state attorney who's a Democrat. She was censored at a college campus.
Hi, Senator. What does Section 3A say?
Could you read it to me? I'll pull it up while you're doing that.
Yes, the House Committee on Education will oversee the enactment of this legislation. That's currently liberally dominated. It's dominated by Democrats. Doesn't that provide some sort of balance?
It doesn't, because they don't get any say in appointing members. It's really the members who are making the decisions.
They're literally overseeing the implementation of this entire legislation.
Again, who is the one making the decisions? It's the appointees.
Should this Congress ever pass legislation based on who is in office?
We have to take that into account.
But should we pass legislation based on who is in office? Like, should we
I don't think that's a fair question. I think a fair question is one about whether or not we should consider it. And I think the answer is yes.
It is a fair question because you just said that President Trump and many other presidents will be biased. So should we take that into account?
Exactly. We should take it into account.
So just because there's a president who disagrees with you,
Representative Blackburn.
Okay, so let's say your task force is partisan enough that they completely ignore all complaints from liberals.
Right.
How is that a net harm? Because at least conservatives are having their complaints addressed, right?
Yeah, but isn't that very unfair? The basis of this legislation is to protect free speech across all backgrounds.
So I would agree it's unfair. I don't want to see that happen, but it's still not a net harm. It's still an improvement.
Oh, it absolutely is a net harm. Then you have conservatives brainwashing people on college campuses with no checks and vice versa in another administration.
Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be seated. All right, or excuse me, muted. All right, that was a speech in negation. All speakers in the affirmation, please rise. Representative Kaiser, between Representative Chandy and Representative Kaiser does have precedence.
Hi everyone, that's Representative Kaiser, spelled K-A-I-S-E-R. Once again, K-A-I-S-E-R. Judges, just give me a thumbs up when you guys are ready. And I'm speaking, of course, on the affirmation. Good, Pio good, Parley good. Second judge. Oh, sorry, couldn't find you. All right. As a child, my parents took me to many protests and rallies because they wanted me to see what freedom of speech really looked like. As I grew up, that gave me the opportunity to share my thoughts and feelings on numerous topics without criticism. It's because today's legislation expands that opportunity for college students all over the nation that you pass today's legislation because it encourages integrated learning by making students feel represented in colleges. The Washington Post in September of 2016 writes that controversial speakers rose racial and religious representation on many colleges and university campuses last year, making minorities feel included on campus. But here's the thing, when you have more underrepresentation, it's actually extremely harmful for these colleges. Because Brandeis University in 2019 explains that enrollment is up at historically Black colleges and universities and down at integrated colleges due to increased racial tensions on college campuses over the past few years. Jewish students try to stay away from historically liberal universities during the application process in fear that they won't be represented. And the same is true for African American students. But when you pass today's legislation, you actually change that by ensuring that controversial speakers give them the opportunity to be represented. Essentially, we make that minority underrepresentation a problem of the past. I ask the chamber, how can you expect to have diverse viewpoints at a college with no diversity? Today's legislation changes that. It's time we learn a lesson. It's time we pass. But next, today's legislation encourages social development by increasing funding for school-sponsored clubs and events. The Atlantic explains in March of 2019 that President Trump's administration released its budget proposal for the fiscal year of 2020 with a 10% cut in funding for the DOE. It would, for the third year in a row, seek to eliminate school-sponsored clubs, extracurriculars, and grants for schools under Title I and Title IV programs. Those are the exact schools under today's legislation. Now, Representative Rosen, you claim that because the task force isn't going to be bipartisan, the DOE is going to do what's best for their party and not for education. But here's where that argument falls. The head of the DOE, Betsy DeVos, isn't going to prioritize her party over education if it means that our students are losing opportunities. It's time we start prioritizing postgraduates over parties. A meta-analysis conducted by the University of Southern Mississippi in 2012 explains that cuts in federal funding force colleges to shut down public speaking programs, fine arts, cultural programs, and social programs as they can't afford to cut down on STEM or core classes. The Department of Education knows that the current budget cuts are forcing student speech to be limited. There is no reason they would find controversial speakers and cut more funding for these schools, meaning that this task force is going to be affected. You passed today's legislation to encourage free speech and encourage minority representation. Don't sit in silence. Speak up for what's right and pass.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We're now moving to standard 2-block questioning periods. Questioners, please rise. It'll first go to Representative Rosen.
What stops the Attorney General and the Secretary of Education from appointing all Republicans to the task force?
Okay, nothing's stopping them, but here's what I'm saying. Both the people on the Department of Education and the Attorney General, the people who he appoints or she appoints, are going to know that the students are being affected by the legislation. And there is no reason to find a cut in funding if it means that the students are—
Can we look at the past precedent to show that they don't always take into consideration the priorities of the American people?
I think it's common sense that—
Well, look at the task forces they appointed in the past.
That no politician would prioritize their party.
What about the task forces they already made?
Representative Sedlak.
What incentive does Betsy DeVos have in including liberal perspectives on the commission?
Because if she actually finds that disinviting liberal speakers is bad for schools, then she's going to cut funding for—
In the United States, our politicians—
which means that when those schools are underfunded, programs like social programs and cultural programs are cut. Sorry.
Can I ask a question? In the United States, are politicians known for their bipartisanship?
Not necessarily, but that doesn't mean—
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you may not take your placards and be muted. That was a speech in the affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, Representative Burns has not yet spoken, so she has precedence.
I thank the chair. I am Senator Burns, spelled B-U-R-N-S, and judges, please just give me a thumbs up when you all are ready. Sorry, just give me a second.
You're good.
When it comes to education in this Congress, we talk more about how to keep our students safe than we do curriculum, funding, and resources. This debate is no different. Schools should always prioritize learning, especially when it comes to teaching tolerance. But a few new ideas from a speaker are not worth even the smallest amount of disruption or violence in response. Don't punish universities for trying to keep students and speakers safe. So let this Congress understand why college rejects speakers in the first place. First, it is a cost factor when inviting speakers who are controversial. This cost stems from the damage to the area during the speech. Jillian Berman with the Market Watch on March 5th, 2019 states that the University of California spent roughly $4.8 million on security in 2017, surrounding appearances from controversial speakers like Ben Shapiro, who were invited by student groups, according to the university. The University of Florida spent $500,000 to keep its campus safe, with white nationalist Richard Spencer appeared there in 2017. And on June 30th, 2018, according to the university officials, to provide security in McCorkle Place, the quad, which houses a statue of a Confederate soldier known as Silent Sam, the statue was toppled by protesters in August of 2018. Colleges turn away these speakers for the cost of damage and the cost of their safety. Now, second, another factor of the rejections are trying to keep the safety of every single person present. Speakers rile up crowds, which in turn leads to physical harm. Washington Examiner with Melissa Quinn on September 19th, 2017 states that nearly 1 out of 5 college students believe it is acceptable for a student group to use violence to silence a controversial speaker at an on-campus event. The survey from John Valester, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, sheds light on college students' attitudes towards the understanding of the First Amendment. Recently, controversial and conservative speakers scheduled to speak on college campuses nationwide have faced opposition and even violent protests, causing some university to cancel their appearances. According to the survey by John Vallisner, this is what happened. It is necessary for this Congress to understand that with these stipulations, Congress should not try to accuse them of harm by creating a biased task force to go after them. Instead of violating the First Amendment, colleges are just protecting everyone. Do not create a task force that may incentivize them into choosing to allow the speaker, even with the destruction it entails. Negate.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 2 minutes and 43 seconds. Questioners, please rise. All right, between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Kaiser.
Hi, Representative. So what's security like in most college campuses?
So security isn't always the best, so they have to hire like off-campus security.
Okay, so when we actually get these controversial speakers to come in and speak, that incentivizes colleges to actually spend more on security, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that. So I'm trying to say that when these controversial speakers come in, colleges have to spend like such a vast amount of money more to actually protect every single person there.
Doesn't that protect their students in the long term as well?
Well, no, because it only happens for a single day or the single moment that the controversial speaker is there.
But if they have a lot of controversial speakers and they spend more on it, it'll
Representative Kandi.
Isn't there a difference between a controversial speaker and a violent speaker?
Well, I would say that it's not always the speaker that is violent. So as I said, like 1 in 5 students believe that they should resort to violence if the person who is speaking has a different ideal or different viewpoint than themselves.
So then why does today's legislation actually just target the speaker itself then?
So I'm trying to say that like this incentivizes colleges to like decrease spending because we're going to increase the amount of speakers.
Thank you,
colleges,
Representative.
right?
Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be seated. That was a speech in negation. All speakers in the affirmation, please rise. Between those standing, Representative, what is it? Excuse me, there's like one more. Okay, between Representative Blackburn, Chandi, it's going to go to Representative Blackburn. And Mayor.
You
just a quick note, please raise your placards a little bit high. Representative Blackburn, I couldn't see it, your placard at first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hold on. I'm just having computer issues. Just give me a second. Thank you.
It's okay.
Judges, when you guys are ready, just thumbs up. Thank you. Thus far in the debate, the affirmation has called attention to the status quo issue of the heckler's veto suppressing free speech and speakers being disinvited because of their viewpoints. We've heard repeatedly that free speech is being infringed upon, but this chamber has been deprived of an explanation for the fundamental importance of free speech to universities. And it is because first, free speech allows students to develop mature worldviews, and second, the negation arguments simply carry no weight that we negate today. But first, affirm this bill because free speech allows students to develop mature worldviews. And that's because exposure to opposing worldviews is the process by which our own is refined. Jean Piaget, a 20th century Swiss developmental psychologist, writes that children construct an understanding of the world around them, their worldview. Then they experience discrepancies between what they already know and what they discover in their environment, then adjust their worldview accordingly. This is the basic process by which we construct ever more sophisticated worldviews that do ever better jobs of matching reality. In fact, physicist David Deutsch, in his book, The Beginning of Infinity, goes even further. He argues that conjecture and refutation is the only way, in principle, that knowledge can be acquired. He says that all advancements in thought are done through testing of an idea. And so for college students who are developing mature worldviews, their existing ones must be tested. If they aren't, college students go into the world with stunted worldviews, which then become more or less permanent. Paul Bloom, in his book How Pleasure Works, published in 2010, writes that people are most receptive to new influences between the ages of 20 and 24. These are the most crucial years for the formation of your personality. For example, the music you like at 24 is the music you will probably like for the rest of your life. And the types of people you like at 24 are the people you will probably like for the rest of your life. We could say that the university experience is crucial in the formation of the self, and crucial to a mature and sophisticated formation is the encounter with opposing views. That's why we affirm. But second, we affirm because the negation arguments carry no weight. First, Senator Rosen tells us that this is a partisan solution to censorship. But as I explained in my cross-examination, his point doesn't prove the bill does any harm, because even if the task force decided to ignore all complaints from liberal speakers and only address conservatives being censored, it's still a net benefit, as at least some people have their rights respected compared to none in the negation world. Next, Senator Burns tells us how this punishes universities, forces universities to incur the security costs, but universities actually won't have to pay these costs for long, because they can simply disincentivize these unruly protests with stricter rules. In fact, Jeremy Peters of the New York Times in 2018 writes that in response to federal guidelines on free speech, many universities are imposing vastly stricter rules, such as 3 strikes rules, to crack down on student protests. Once students find that protesting is going to land them in a lot of trouble, they're not going to protest, and universities don't have to pay for security. It's because first, this bill, free speech allows students to develop mature worldviews, and second, the negation arguments carry no weight, that we want to pass this bill. Stand with me.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 7 seconds. Before we go to questions, will the spectator from James B. Conant High School please leave? We have a live stream available. You can watch the chamber through there. All right, I'm assuming they're gonna leave or the parley will kick them. All right, thank you for that speech. All questioners, please rise. Between those standing, Representative Burns will go first.
Hi, Senator. I do believe that they should have different viewpoints and that this current time period is the best point for them to be exposed to other places. But do you believe that college campuses are the correct places to do this with so many students that could be harmed?
If there's one place to do this, it would be the university.
Okay, so why is that?
Because the university is the place by which people receive an education about differing worldviews. That's where you get.
Okay, but it's like, so you talk about a 1 to 3 strike program, right? Like, how effective is this?
Representative Pontus.
Senator, so a lot of the controversial speakers are extreme right-wing nationalists. Do students need to listen to racist ideas to expand their worldview?
Well, I would dispute that. I don't think most of the controversial speakers by any means are right-wing nationalists, but
A lot of them are. In fact, Milo Yiannopoulos, sorry,
Right.
I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but
for those cases that of right-wing speakers, students absolutely don't have to listen to those worldviews.
Okay, so
that's why the speeches are optional to attend.
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placards and be seated. For the parley, are you just going to kick out James B. Conant High School? I'm just going to continue it. All right.
I already hit kick on them. They're trying to get back in, so they'll be gone in a second.
Okay. All right, that was a speech and affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Gandhi.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Gandhi, still spelled Gandhi. As always, at the leisure of all of those above me, just give me any indication when you're ready, and just give me a second to pin the up. All right, cool. Awesome. In the United States, rising tuition has further cloistered our institutions of higher learning from hubs of intellectualism to ivory towers. But thousands of students in the United States live in a fear from a war on words being waged to their consent of their university. Failing today's legislation isn't just a protection, it's a guarantee that we will never force universities to ignore the desires of its students by appealing to an authority that was meant to liberate them, not undermine their stability. The main reason you failed today is because today's legislation just leads to more protests. Now, Senator Lee brought up heckler's veto, which Senator Blackburn expanded on, how protests are almost exclusively the way that universities decide to disinvite speakers. And he's right. As USA Today explains in June of 2018, universities avoid politically controversial speakers after student protests, because protests are almost always more dangerous for their PR, for student safety, endowment offers, and for potential lawsuits than a few angry emails. This means that any single time that a university has to end up disinviting speakers, the students who protest cost the university millions of dollars in endowments, or how Senator Burns explains, in miscellaneous costs, which almost exclusively trades off regressively with things like financial aid, because historically, universities have given very poor attention to people of color. As the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities explains in August of 2016, funding cuts drives up tuition, lowers the amount of financial aid available, and makes a college education disproportionately less accessible for minority students. But now that I mentioned to you all the negatives to protesting, why would you still have to disinvite people even if you pass today's legislation? Students know that protesting is pragmatically bad for them, but they still do it. Why? Because you cannot, in fact, convince people who think that all conservatives are evil or that all liberals shouldn't be in power that, oh, we're so sorry, we're not going to do this anymore, and expect them to respond like, oh yeah, that seems reasonable. No, people will still protest. But more importantly, it makes the federal government look like we just couldn't care less about the interests of students. So it just creates more anti-institutionalism, which is a driving motivator for having the protests in the first place. So maybe you don't get a protest about the speakers in the short term, but you are going to have a protest about this policy, which will lead to the desire to have open discourse about these things by inviting speakers to talk about it. So to the moral arguments of Senators Lee and Kaiser, maybe this is violating the First Amendment in the absolute worst case scenario, but it's unclear what the counterfactual is. Are you just supposed to let riots happen? You can't just make people give up caring about things. And Senator Kaiser, I admire your intentions, but you can't ignore the clear precedent that Senator Rosen gives us in the forms of biased committee. We're as moral as you were. We live in a better world, but it's time that we deal with the reality and not the rhetoric, because all this bill does is criminalize against the very institutions that administrations would be against. Today's legislation is clearly exacerbated by the political polarization we currently live in, but it doesn't matter if you side with the left or side with the right, because when making decisions, you should always side with logic. Negate.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 2 minutes and 56 seconds. Questioners, please rise. All right, give me 1 second to get everybody in. All right, between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Lee.
So are you saying that violent protests are okay because we can't stop people from expressing their free speech?
I'm saying you increase the amount of violent protests you have if you pass the legislation.
Why? Why can't universities just like put some like measures in place to stop them?
Right, so that's what they're doing right now, and obviously it's not working because they still have violent protests.
So how would task forces be a net harm?
So what I'm saying is if you block the ability for students to protest, then they inherently protest against that, because that's one of the founding ideas that they're so proud of that they can do in their universities. That just ends up harming them more.
So people are proud of protesting, so they'll protest even more.
Representative Sun.
You're muted.
Yeah.
My bad. How does this bill block protests?
It doesn't block protests. So what I'm saying is basically, if you're not allowed to disinvite speakers, right? You still have the students that protest against it.
What part of this bill doesn't allow you to disinvite speakers? It only says the task force has to investigate it. What part of this bill actually forces you to not disinvite a speaker?
Again, so inherently you're creating a major incentive to not disinvite.
It's wrong to just allow a task force to have an investigation about it. It's not a final decision.
Because if the investigation finds them in violation, then you cut off.
But does this bill legally codify the decision?
No, but again, the task.
All it does is codify an investigation.
Due to a lack of time, you can take your placards and be muted. That was a speech in negation. All speakers in the affirmation, please rise. Between those standing, it'll go to Representative Shen.
Everyone, the Senator Shen.
I apologize. It'll actually go to Representative Barua. My bad.
No worries.
I thank the chair. That is Senator Barua, spelled B-A-R-U-A. Any visual indication? We're good? We're good. Awesome. Give me a second to pin. I will begin as soon as possible. I pride myself on being a senator that makes laws. And so far in this debate, I've seen the crowning paradox of the round that's preventing us from making one. As servants of our liberal secular democracy that strives to inculcate tolerance and mutual respect, do we have to tolerate the expression of intolerance? It would seem that I am the only lawmaker in a chamber of lawyers because the constitutional answer is yes, and still we're fighting about it. Today, you understand how this legislation only supports social discourse, and you pass. But first, you pass to address the task force, which has been a black sheep in this entire debate. Let me provide the efficacy that the affirmation is lacking. It's because it's an issue when we look to how the Department of Education has dealt with lobbying from post-secondary institutions. When you see that harm, you understand that the task force as an alternative actually isn't so bad, because according to Kerry Murakami for Inside Higher Ed, who tells us 2 months ago that a decade ago, Bucknell University was among 700 higher educational institution groups that spent $100 million to hire lobbyists in Washington, many of them hitting up Congress for earmarks to pay on things like a new campus lab or building. But that has dropped since we're no longer the ones who are making the executive decisions on these fundings. Instead, colleges are pushing efforts to influence the Department of Education. And at a time when agencies consider changes to policies, like controversial speakers, for example, we actually deal with less security and less costs because we crack down on that very same lobbying. In today's debate, that's the point that's going to make the most sense, because it doesn't matter what this task force ends up deciding. The fact that there's a task force in the first place dilutes the power of congressional members who stay complacent right now because their pockets are being lined by the very same departments they have grievances against. I won't stand for that. But next, allow me to address the so far negative arguments. Senator Rosen comes up and champions the idea that the task force is biased because it will be dominated by a certain political party. First of all, the impacts for political polarization are limited at best because the composition of the task force can actually be changed. Because according to a Prosper Act that this very Senate passed in December of 2018, HR 4508 says that a new Secretary of Education will be allowed to replace members of committees like task force. I bring you a precedent that Senator Rosen asked in questioning. The National Advisory Committee on the Institutional Quality and Integrity is an advisory body that provides recommendations to the Secretary of the Department of Education and the Workforce, the enforcement department in this legislation. They say that those recommendations can change the membership composition of the task force that pulls this information into the legislation in the first place. So understand, this is all about information. The information that controversial speakers bring may be controversial at best, but it provides discourse, and this legislation accounts for that. Pass.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Maher.
Senator Barua, fantastic speech. So just
Thank you.
Under today's piece of legislation, what incentive do colleges have to even invite a controversial speaker?
Right, so I'm glad you brought that up. Currently, colleges are like ankle deep in litigation because of the very same controversial speech problems. And so they're going to weigh the cost of a task force against hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal settlements. I argue that's more weight.
I'm saying that all of the discourse that you talk about is predicated on the idea that they will continue to invite these speakers. What I'm saying is that they have no incentive to do so if they risk getting all of their federal funds.
Okay, well, they have an incentive because when they prevent these speakers from coming up, they face lawsuits.
Invite them.
Hi, Senator. So
Hi.
when you invite more speakers to your college, you encourage debate, right?
Right.
But that would be because the speakers are on both sides, right?
Sure.
So if the task force is biased, as some negation speakers say, and they only invite speakers from one side, how is
The
that
task
still
force is
encouraging
biased,
debate?
sure, because of the Attorney General and the Department of Education. That's fine. But regardless, if the Department of Education and the Workforce and that health committee finds bias, they can change the membership composition. It's not final.
Okay, but what if they never find the bias and it just keeps happening?
There's obviously bias. This chamber has
Thank you,
established that.
Representative. You may now take your placards and be muted.
I thank the chair.
No problem. That was a speech in the affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, it'll go to Representative Slevin. Representative Slevin.
I thank the chair. Can I have a thumbs up once everyone can hear me and you're all ready? Awesome. According to the Pew Research Center, the idea of free speech on college campuses has been one of the biggest partisan issues of this decade. So I don't want a single more second of today's debate to go by without understanding that this is an inherently partisan issue. So that's why you're going to negate today's piece of legislation. Allow me to give you the 1, 2, 3 on this piece of legislation. Understand how sections 1, 2, and 3 are all in and of themselves reason to negate. First, Section 1 establishes a political task force that defines when freedom of speech is violated on college campuses. Senator Lee said that the Supreme Court would support this bill, but this bill would mean that politicians define the First Amendment, not the courts. That's not only undemocratic, it violates our separation of powers. But as if that wasn't enough, we move on to Section 2, which establishes a task force made of 9 members decided by the Attorney General and 9 members decided by the Department of Education. That's the root issue of this bill and one we've talked a lot about. Senator Lee, this isn't in the least bit a bipartisan debate because Republicans such as President Donald Trump and Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos have come down on colleges for uninviting speakers, while Democrats such as Senator Bernie Sanders and former Secretary Hillary Clinton have supported colleges in this fight. Well, Senator Rosen, you're absolutely right about the administrations being partisan, but what does that mean for today's debate? Well, it means that in a Democratic administration, this bill will go entirely unenforced, as the president's cabinet will appoint task force members that are lenient on colleges. And it means that in a Republican administration, the definition of free speech will be liberally defined so the task force comes down on colleges with impunity. So Senator Barua, it doesn't matter if the president is red or blue because you have partisanship no matter what. And Senator Kaiser, Secretary DeVos has cut funding to special education departments and the Department of Education at large. So yes, the courts will be cutting education budgets for colleges if you have the chance. And that brings us to Section 3, perhaps the most harmful section of all, which says that if a college is in violation with the task force, they'll lose all federal funds. So if you affirm this piece of legislation and allow a Republican president to establish this task force, that task force is going to come down on colleges just as the Pew Research Center said they would. And that is catastrophic because according to the Pew Charitable Trust, universities receive an average of 16% of funding from the federal government. So Senator Blackburn, there's no way for students to expand their worldview if their educational institution is defunded. This piece of legislation is a conservative dog whistle to come down on what they think are the liberal elite. We have to understand that this piece of legislation, first, undermines the definition of freedom of speech, and second, undermines our education. Don't let this get the better of you. Fail.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of exactly 3 minutes. Questioners, please rise. Between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Barua.
Thank you. So is the composition of this task force final, or can it be changed?
Yeah, so it's going to be changed with every new president.
Yeah, so what's the problem with... Okay, so regardless of Republicans and Democrats, we have a mechanism that allows us to make decisions if we see bias, right?
Well, I don't know who we is because it's not.
We
this
as in the
Congress.
Senate.
I mean, sure, but every time you have a new president, that president gets to pick whoever
Okay,
they want.
so let's look at what doesn't change. Regardless, the task force reports to the same department, right? And that department has said that they won't tolerate bias.
Representative Blackburn.
Okay, so are public universities considered extensions of the government?
Depends. They're extensions usually of the state government from which they came from.
Right. And are government agencies and extensions permitted to discriminate based on viewpoint?
Well, no, they're not. But we usually we literally have the court system to decide that for us, not a bunch of partisan actors appointed by the Department of Education and the Attorney General.
Right, but it seems like there's a pretty objective standard. You can't invite some speakers based on viewpoint.
Thank you, representatives. You may now take your placard and be seated. That was a speech. No problem. That was a speech in the negation. All speakers in the affirmation, please rise. Between those standing, it'll go to Representative Cox.
Thank you. Whenever everyone is ready. In Greek mythology, the beast, the Hydra, has a special paradox. When you cut off one of its heads, two grow back in its place. That's the same paradox we face with today's legislation, because the more colleges disinvite radical right speakers, the more the radical right benefits from that bias. I ask you to pass today's legislation for the sake of backlash. First, pass today's legislation because banning bigotry is counterproductive. When colleges disinvite outside speakers to avoid offensive or disturbing comments, those attempts often backfire. The ACLU Speech on Campus Access this month reports that when the University of Michigan instituted a policy to prohibit bigoted speech, it fueled bigoted backlash where 20 African-American students were charged with racist speech instead of the people who were actually racist and actually bigoted. Free speech icon PEN America concluded October 17, 2016, that except in the most extreme cases, concerns over the potential outbreak of violence should not be grounds for canceling a controversial speech or event. An environment where too many offenses are considered impermissible or even punishable becomes sterile, constraining, and reactionary. When offensive speech is banned or restricted, it is the offending position that benefits. Senator Gandhi pretends that the student riots only exist when controversial speakers are allowed to speak at colleges, but that's even farther from the truth, because in fact, riots happen even more violently when speakers are disinvited. Pass today's legislation because there are very few saints among us. A student's job is to learn to sort one's truth from the background of lies, and today's legislation promotes that. But second, this is also a constitutional issue, as I'm sure you've heard with the other speakers, and it demands a national response because today's legislation preempts unjust and inconsistent state solutions. When Congress starts restricting, or when colleges start restricting usually right-wing speech, red state legislators are always striking back, and sometimes they do so vindictively. Today's legislation preempts those state efforts with a fair and nationally consistent solution. Inside Higher Ed, September 16, 2019 reports, a state legislative proposal requires the University of Wisconsin colleges to expel mostly liberal students who have been found interfering with the rights of mostly right-wing speakers. But Senator Rosen and Slevin take issue with the partisan side of this task force. I have two responses. First, this Congress should never legislate based on who is in power and whether you disagree with that person's views. We don't forego education funding because Betsy DeVos is not a fan of public schools. And second, look to Section 3A, where it says that this Congress has oversight over that administration. The solution to hate speech is more speech, never censorship.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes, 10 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Representative Gandhi.
Okay, so you would agree that, I mean, obviously there's a majority in the House at any given time, right?
Yes.
So that means that inherently, even if there is oversight, it's going to be biased in terms of who has the majority on the oversight committee.
Sure, but I'm saying that still, the oversight committee still stands.
No, but then if you're disproportionately targeting, let's say, liberal institutions, if there's a conservative dominated House, or conservative institutions if there's a liberal dominated House.
So I'm saying it checks back, right? So if we have a Republican president in office and administration and then a Democratic controlled House like we do in the status quo, they check against each other.
But that's not always.
Representative Slevin.
Thank you. So in the status quo, whoever the Secretary of Education is, can they individually defund individual colleges?
Like without today's legislation?
Right.
There has to be a strong basis.
Right. So if in the status quo you can't defund individual institutions, why would you want to allow anyone to do that in the affirmation?
Because I strongly value the right of freedom of speech.
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you now take your placards and be muted.
Thank
That
you.
was no problem. That was a speech and affirmation. All speakers in negation, please rise. It'll go to Representative Martinez, unopposed.
I thank the chair. Hello again, I'm Senator Martinez. I'm speaking on the negation. Whenever my parley, PO, and judges are ready, I'll be happy to begin. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. The Princeton Review offers different rankings of colleges based on unique criteria, like how many tree-hugging vegans go to the school or which has the best party scene. But when I was reading colleges figuring out where to apply, I found out there were two interesting lists, most conservative and most liberal. We are so divided that even our college decisions can be polarized. Today's legislation only seeks to further that divide. Fail this bill. First, fail today's legislation because it does not apply to all events. I'm surprised no one's brought this up. I direct everyone to Section 1, which states that today's legislation applies to all school-sponsored events, meaning anyone who is invited by the school is now going to be checked, not speakers invited by student groups. And that's a bigger problem than we think. For example, in March of 2017, a club at Middlebury College invited Dr. Charles Murray to speak, but because of protests, his event had to be ended early by the administration. That's exactly the type of thing we're seeing happen often without any check on it. And today's legislation only ensures that we can check the colleges and the universities, not what most of the time are student groups who invite these speakers. And the issue with that is that when we give in to the ability for schools to censor these speakers, it creates a political divide between students. As Peter Beinart of NYU writes in an Atlantic article published on March 16th of 2017, he explains, denying them the right by giving progressive students a veto over who conservative students can invite comes perilously close to giving progressive students a veto over what conservative students can say. It doesn't matter if you're a liberal or a conservative or a libertarian. Every single one of us deserves a right to express ourselves on a college campus. We maintain a polarized atmosphere if we do not protect these student-invited speakers. Now, first, I would like to address the author of today's legislation, Senator Lee. You provided us with the wrong framework. This isn't about schools violating the freedom of speech. The legal precedent from the case you cited affirmed Feiner's arrest because he was a threat to public safety. And today's legislation, as Senator Rosen and Senator Burns brought up, corners schools into double jeopardy because they have to spend money on security. But then let's move on to the fact that today's legislation encourages partisan policymaking. Senator Sun asked him questioning how these policies would be codified into law. Here's how. Jeremy Peters of the New York Times reports on June 14th of 2018 that Republican-controlled legislatures are legislating laws that censor student protests on campus, especially if they're liberal and even when they're peaceful. And now the task force has to report to the committee with recommendations on what to do. We've talked about this, how this task force isn't bipartisan, but we haven't talked about what they're actually going to do. They're going to make recommendations to Congress which censor speakers. That's the impact of doing so. This bill may be polarized, but there should be a clear consensus for the negation.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes on the dot. Questioners, please rise. All right, between those standing, Ms. Barrow, are you standing? It'll first go to Representative Lee.
Hi, so let's go back to Feiner. So why was he considered an obstacle to the public or disturbance to the public?
It was based off of the reaction to the crowd, not the content he was discussing.
So why is that his fault? Because he got arrested.
Yeah, it's because he was inciting the crowd to have a violent response. We're not trying to censor anybody.
Because of what he was saying, he was arrested. That doesn't make any sense.
The Supreme Court dictated that it was not because of his content. It was because
No.
of
They
the
dictated
action of
that.
the crowd.
They dictated that because of what he was saying, like the use of force.
They made an effort to say it's not about content.
Hey, so you agree with me that free speech is a good idea, right?
Yes,
And Trump is the one who ultimately has the discretion over the appointees of the task force.
essentially, yes.
What is Trump's stance on free speech on campuses?
Yeah, he's most likely to support conservative speakers over liberal speakers.
Actually wanted to sign an executive order promoting free speech on campuses. Why is this a bad
Sure,
thing?
when it benefits him.
What? No, he wanted to sign an executive order to
But
allow
it's
free
President
speech on
Voss and William Barr that are calling the shots.
Thank you, Representative. Due to a lack of time, you can now be muted. That was a speech in negation. All speakers in affirmation, please rise. Between those standing, Representative Shen has the best precedence.
Hey everyone, that's Representative Shen, still spelled the same way, like my placard. Whenever you're ready. Actually, I'm gonna pin the PO, so can you let me know when the judges are ready?
The judges are ready.
Cool, thank you. Free speech as a fundamental right is something that should be protected by all. I'm sure all of us campaigned for our positions with that in mind, and above all, that we have their backs. But this Congress fails its obligations the day we become silent about laws and institutions we stand for. That's why you affirm. Pass to protect the students who are silenced the most. First, let's address Senator Gandhi's and Martinez's worries about student protests increasing and becoming violent, especially with partisanship, which is apparently worsened under the status quo. A couple responses to this. First, more student protests isn't necessarily a bad thing. Senator Barua proves that in her speech. But second, if you're really worried about violence, you'll actually pass this bill. Senator Cox touches on this about racism on campuses, but here's where she misses it. When student protests become too passionate, it's not just the college, it's actually the police, the people given authority by universities to handle threats, to take action against students. And in those cases, they are exceptionally racist. Harvard University tells us on July of 2017, minorities are 50% more likely to have an interaction with police, which involves any use of force, meaning that they are less likely to protest in the future, even when their rights are taken away. This is why discourse is so important. When you pass this bill, you finally protect that. Right now, there isn't enough enforcement because of bad enforcement, but by passing, we change that precedent. Why does that happen? I'll be the first person on the affirmation to argue that the enforcers and members in sections 2A and 2B are going to create positive progress compared to the status quo. The entire negation from Senator Rosen to Slevin would focus on how partisanship affects enforcement, including Senator Martinez. Recognize this bill is about violence or peace, justice or discriminatory. However, regardless of which party line they come from, the members will always choose peace in the colleges. Even if they do investigations, they don't necessarily want to take funding away because it only worsens student life for everyone, including the people they want to protect, whether they're biased towards them or not. That's because this bill institutes a task force composed of members. The University of Minnesota tells us on August of 2016, 46% of colleges were fined by the House Committee on Education for the abuse of students when using campus police, creating a safer environment for students. You further that initiatives when you pass. If students thought education was expensive, our ignorance pays a larger price. The only side in this round that can change that fundamental disparity is mine. These measures fundamentally change the status quo to represent prosperity of our students instead of devastation of our schools. Affirm.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 9 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Burns.
Thank you. Hi, Senator. I was just wondering, so you're talking about like how police, they basically enforce what is happening with protests. Why do colleges then fund for private?
Right. I think there's a misunderstanding. Let me clarify. When protests get too passionate, the police comes. But when they do, they disproportionately arrest and punish minorities rather than whoever's protesting.
Okay, but would this would this end with the passage of this bill?
Yes, because they have investigated.
Representative Rosen.
Do you think that 18 Republicans are the best group of individuals to fight police brutality?
Yeah, I gave you the example in
2016.
Really?
18 Republicans?
Can I answer your question?
Sure, yeah.
I gave you the example in 2016 when the Trump administration was still in place. Then the enforcement of fair campus police still increased, meaning it'll happen again.
So those are going to be identical task forces?
Not identical people.
Thank you, representatives. You may now be muted. That was a speech in the affirmation. Speakers in negation, please rise. Between those standing, it'll go to Representative Sedlak.
Thank you. Allow me to pin the presiding officer and get set up for just a moment.
Yep. And your judges are ready, I presume? Yes.
Awesome. Sorry.
For the chamber, at least for about 2 more speeches after this, hopefully.
Cool. The word democracy comes from the Greek roots of demos, meaning the people, and kratia, meaning power, promising that democracies should always empower the people. At the end of today's debate, we as a Congress have to make a decision about whether or not we want to empower our students on college campuses or the agenda of our president on the rhetoric on college campuses. If we are to empower the people, we are to fail this legislation. But first, if we're going to synthesize this argumentation so far, we first have to acknowledge the argument in the round that holds the most weight, the argument we have to remember when we're failing this legislation. In the first negative speech of this round, Senator Rosen proved that the commission will be biased to the president's party because half of the members are chosen by the Attorney General and the other half are chosen by the Secretary of Education, both of which are presidential appointees. Now, Senator Cox has been one of the only speakers on affirmation to actually address this argument. She says that we shouldn't discriminate based on our party. Understand, the negation's problem with this legislation isn't just that Trump is in power, it is that a partisan committee will always be problematic. But let's look at how it will be problematic in the status quo under the Trump administration. Look to Representative Kaiser when he says, why would our Secretary of Education want to make a partisan board when she cares about equal education? He's talking about Betsy DeVos, the same woman who, according to The Guardian in 2019, has worked relentlessly to strip transgender students of rights on college campuses and dismantle Title IX across the country. Senator Bora says that the impact of partisanship on this committee will be negligible. Do not let idealism blind you from the reality of American democracy. Bipartisanship only exists if we mandate it. But next, let's understand that passing this legislation will undoubtedly give unprecedented power to the administration to shape rhetoric on college campuses. Understand that although our sponsor talks about bolstering this freedom of speech on college campuses, nowhere in our Constitution does it say that we have the right to give complete power to an administration to shape rhetoric on college campuses. That's why you fail. This debate should have ended after Senator Rosen's speech, but it didn't. So let's see where else the affirmative fails in today's debate. Representative Kaiser says that controversial speakers actually allow marginalized students to feel represented on college campuses. Understand that in 2019, there were 11 speakers on college campuses who were banned, 6 of which were cited for perpetuating rhetoric to empower misogyny, racism, transphobia, and homophobia. Senator Cox says that we have no right to shut down bigotry on college campuses. Understand that her point still falls flat because we still have a biased committee that is only shutting down one side of the aisle. Before you pass this legislation, understand who you are protecting. If we are to empower the people, we are to fail.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. Questioners, please rise. That'll first go to Representative Shen.
Hi, Senator. How exactly is President Trump going to revoke Title IX from a college simply because of an investigation done because of a protest?
Necessarily say that. I was just talking about the partisanship of Betsy DeVos in particular because she herself has been relentlessly trying to dismantle
Let's talk
Title
about
IX.
partisanship. What are Democrats and Republicans more likely to favor, violence or peace?
Peace depends if they're profiting off of it, probably violence.
Right. So they would allow protests to go through more, right? But they wouldn't necessarily investigate in a harmful way because that would just...
Representative Blackburn.
Partisanship is bad.
So let's put this partisanship issue to rest. Senator Slevin on your side said that free speech for speakers is almost entirely a conservative cause. Do you agree with him?
Not necessarily. Like it is right now because most of the speakers who are banned would identify with the conservative side, but under the passage of this legislation, who knows what could happen.
So almost all the speakers being disinvited are conservatives, if you just look at the lists of the speakers. So where is there an opportunity for this task force?
Thank you, representatives. Due to a lack of time, you'll now take your placard and have be muted. That was a speech in negation. Speakers in the affirmation, please rise. That'll go between Representative Sun and Chandy to Chandy.
I thank the chair. Just give me a second to pin the PO. Is everyone ready?
A quick question to the chamber. Please raise your hand if you're wishing to speak on this legislation still. 3 more? We're counting 3 more? Okay.
Yeah, with the 5-minute extension, we should be able to allow it, but that would be up to the party.
Yeah, let's see where we stand when we get to the end of time.
Okay, you're good to go.
In April 2017, at Claremont McKenna College, students prevented an author, Heather McDonald, from giving public addresses about her new book, War on Cops. The students' arguments stated that by inviting her to campus, the administration is giving its approval to her views on race and policing. It is now often students and faculty calling for preventing the speakers, while campus officials are steadfastly protecting freedom of expression. But free speech is the cornerstone of our democracy, and that's why we affirm. But first, protect controversial speakers, because censorship is not protected by the First Amendment. Every great champion of African American freedom in our history, including Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr., all have been warriors of freedom of expression. To suppress free speech is a double wrong, Douglass stated in 1860. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as the speaker. Our Constitution protects controversial speech. Keep in mind, there's a line when controversial crosses over and becomes harassment or threats. Senator Burns, realize there's actually a difference between being controversial and being violent. The Constitution protects being controversial. Let's examine what controversial is not. Creating a pervasive, hostile environment, something every negative speaker needs to understand in today's debate. Censoring speech will always end up harming the people whom it aims to protect. Controversial, critical, confrontational, and challenging speech is all covered by our Constitution. In fact, the Supreme Court has spilled barrels of ink defining what our First Amendment rights are. In the case of Tinker v. Des Moines, Mary Beth Tinker, a 13-year-old junior high school student, wore a black armband to school to protest the Vietnam War. But here's what the Supreme Court stated. Students may not be confined to the expression of those sentiments that are officially approved. It is therefore critical that Title IV higher education institutions, which process U.S. federal student aid, allow students and speakers of varying views so that students may be trained to really listen to ideas that they hate and respond with better ones. And that's why we pass. But second, pass today's legislation because free speech, which may be deemed as controversial, is essential for the advancement of rights and equality. According to Vox in December of 2017, free speech may sound controversial, but nonetheless gave birth to the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Without widespread demonstrations, women's suffrage movements would not have occurred. The civil rights protests of the 1960s, lunch counter sit-ins, the March on Selma, and demonstrations on campuses were essential to bringing about the end of segregation. The negation lives in a world where they think that our country has perfect policy, where there's no need for any more social policy. But that could not be farther from the truth. When you pass today's legislation, you only promote change in our society, and that's why you pass today's legislation. Don't let the words of the negation fool you. Understand that free speech is a right protected by every single person. Free speech is granted to everyone, every single person in the United States. That's why we pass.
Thank you, Representative. Speech time was 3 minutes and 8 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Between those, it'll first go to Ms. Martinez.
Hi, Senator. So do you know what the Supreme Court said when they made their decision in Tinker versus Des Moines?
Okay, so I just stated that they talked about how students should not be just like zoned into a viewpoint that they don't
It
agree.
protected freedom of expression unless it disrupts the educational process. Don't protest, interrupt the educational process.
I just stated how they also said that students shouldn't be confined to the expression of those sentiments that are officially approved, meaning that they should.
That has nothing to do with my question. So how do we...
Representative Sedlak.
Hi, Representative Chandy. Does passing today's legislation in any way take away the freedom of speech from the students on these college campuses?
Well, now colleges won't actually feel the incentive to get these speakers to come to their university in the first place.
Yeah, but if they do invite a speaker and the students don't like it and like petition and protest, isn't that in their prerogative to do so?
Wait, what do you mean in the college's prerogative?
No, in the students.
Thank you, representatives. Due to lack of time, you will not be muted. All negative speakers, please rise. Between those standing, it'll go to Representative Maher. Oh, yes, Representative Maher.
I thank the chair. Just give me one moment. That's all right. I I just have thumbs up from all my judges when you're ready. Great, great. Awesome. A 2016 CNN survey found that nearly 10% of college grads believe that Judge Judy serves on the Supreme Court. And while that may sound ridiculous, this Congress has taken it one step further today. We believe that we are the Supreme Court. Under today's legislation, we are trying to set a precedent for hate speech and hold the trial ourselves. But let's understand why at the end of today's debate, the affirmation and the negation, which I stand on, have both grossly mischaracterized their advocacies. Let's understand how today's debate doesn't actually boil down to which side best bolsters free speech, but which side actually achieves their impacts. The only question remaining in today's debate is, will colleges still invite contentious speakers? I asked Representative Barua this in questioning, and she was incredibly confused. Now let's hear the advocacy from the affirmation before answering this question. Representatives Lee, Kaiser, and Chandy say absolutely they'll continue to invite them. Students will feel more represented. And Representatives Barua, Blackburn, and Cox say that students need to hear opposing views. I would agree with all of them. But the problem is that no matter what side of this legislation you fall, no matter what side of their arguments that you fall on, none of it actually matters. Let me explain why this debate has been grossly mischaracterized. Because if the risks of inviting controversial speakers mean that colleges will lose all funding as constituted in Section 3B, they're not going to invite them in the first place. Yale law professor Robert Post explained in December of 2017 that there is no First Amendment right to speak on college campuses until speakers are invited in the first place, meaning that there are two things that happen when you pass today's legislation. First, controversial speakers are no longer invited in the first place. Today's legislation stipulates penalties for disinviting. So when faced with the choice of losing all federal funding or simply not sending the invitation, the choice is clear. But let's take the affirmation at their highest ground. For some reason, a school still invites a contentious speaker, or a student group is somehow able to pay the fees to host the speaker. Understand the means of recourse that are already available when First Amendment rights have been infringed. The Washington Examiner writes in December 3rd of 2018 that Berkeley administrators enacted a policy to charge conservative students $20,000 to host Ben Shapiro. But in that very case, Young Americans for Freedom, or YAF, the student organization who petitioned for Shapiro, sued UC Berkeley for their cancellation, won the case, received $70,000, and Berkeley was forced to amend their regulations about controversial speakers. We already have forms of recourse in the status quo that solve for these problems. That's why I'd like to distance myself from Senator Rosen, Slevin, and Sedlak on my own side. It doesn't matter how biased a task force is, because colleges won't actually invite these speakers in the first place, so the task force won't actually be doing anything. And the violence Senator Shen, Burns, and Gandhi all talk about is this idle world and is utterly non-unique. Stop giving pre-prepared speeches. Start paying attention. The case is closed, and the verdict is in. You vote neg.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech time of 3 minutes and 4 seconds. Questioners, please rise. Between those standing, it'll first go to Representative Kaiser.
Hi, Representative. So we've already established that when college students don't get what they want, they might result to protests, right?
Do that in the status quo.
Okay, so when we pass today's legislation and colleges don't invite speakers at all, won't that just lead to more protests, leading them to invite
because
speakers?
the speakers were never invited, and there's nothing for the students to protest about. Right now, in the status quo, students can see X person was invited. Now they're no longer invited. In your world, students never have that opportunity.
Right, but if the colleges never invite them at all, the students are going to
No, they're going to invite family figures.
It'll go to Representative Sedlak.
Under the prerogative of today's legislation, if a college doesn't even invite a speaker in the first place, doesn't the committee have the right to rule that as like banning them?
No, because that would mean that this committee would have to investigate literally every single college in America and say, you didn't invite a speaker of this background. Like that's
Yes, but when we have a partisan committee, isn't that in their agenda to be able to?
The committee has literally no feasibility if there's no request. The committee only—
Don't we give them ultimate authority under this
Thank you, Representative. Due to a lack of time, you may now take your placard and have a seat. For the parley, we only need 2 more speeches for everyone who spoke on the first bill to give another speech. Would you want to let that happen, or do you want us to end the chamber?
Let's go. Okay. I might get yelled at, but yeah, let's do it.
All right. We'll now allow 1 or 2 more speeches. So that was a speech in negation. Speakers in the affirmation, please rise. That'll go to Representative Sun.
Thank you. Senator Sun, second time today. Thank you all for letting me speak. On the affirmative, just like last bill, judges, Parley, PO, nod or smile whenever you're ready. Great, great, great. Thank you. Let me pin the PO right now. All right. In my years of experience in this Congress, I haven't seen a chamber so unwilling to read the legislation in front of them. Read Section 1 of today's bill. All that is legally enforceable under today's bill is that an investigation be carried out, not that the results be enforceable. In other words, all today's bill does is ensure that an investigation happens, meaning the punishment of that investigation does not matter because it's not legally binding under today's bill. So why then do you ask? I stand on the affirmative. That's the beauty of today's legislation. It knocks out the majority of the negative. Let's ask ourselves about implementation to answer this question. Senator Rosen tells you that if you pass today's legislation, you'll have conservatives censoring liberals. That's not true because today's bill doesn't give the task force the teeth to actually carry out punishments. Furthermore, Senators Slevin and Rosen talk about how today's legislation erodes the SCOTUS. This bill does not give the task force the teeth to do that either. I want to address the bias partisanship argument brought up about the task force because Senator Maher tells you that universities just won't invite speakers to begin with. That's not true because 3B only revokes funding if you violate the law, but the law does not legally codify the punishment. In other words, as long as universities agree to investigation, they won't have federal funds revoked. But why is this so important? Vox explains in August of 2018 that the majority of speaker incidents have to do with conservative speakers on liberal campuses. That's interesting because the task force under today's bill is going to be conservative because it's appointed by President Trump. So what will that task force likely rule? The Bill of Rights Institution explains that Trump just stated that he wanted an executive order to protect campus speech. That's the opposite of the reality championed by Senator Martinez. If you pass today's piece of legislation, all you do is provide a symbolic piece of support toward free speech and controversial speakers within universities. But why is this so important? The affirmative has definitively won the debate that free speech on campuses is a good idea. But I'd like to introduce the biggest impact of them all. Greg Lukianoff explains in November of 2013 that 16% of protesters strongly agree that it's safe to hold unpopular positions on campus. In other words, without free speech, you can't have discourse on both sides. Remember what I told you in my first speech in today's session. Discourse is a prerequisite to education. It is why people go to college in the first place, to receive that education. And in order to do that, you need to have both streams of discourse present. Today's legislation is a symbolic piece of support towards that free speech. And that's all you need to pass today's bill. If you take nothing else from my experience as a member of this Congress, read the bill, pass it.
Thank you, Representative. That speech time was 3:01. Questioners, please rise. All right, it'll first go to Representative Slevin.
Thank you. So what's the solvency under today's piece of legislation if federal funds aren't taken away?
I'm arguing that the fact that federal funds aren't taken away if you don't agree with the investigation is the beauty of it. It allows more voices to be heard at the discussion.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree that federal funds should never be taken away. But how are there any impacts in today's debate on the affirmation if there's no punishment?
There's no impact on the negative. And the impact on the affirmative is a symbolic one. It's us showing that we symbolically support free speech.
Okay, can you again re-explain to me why you wouldn't see federal funds being taken away if you're found in violation?
Because 3B says you only revoke federal funds if you violate the bill. And the bill doesn't say that the punishment from the investigation is enforceable. It only says there has to be an investigation.
No, but but if the investigation finds you in violation of disinviting speakers.
Right. And I get what you're trying to say, but all this bill mandates is that there is an investigation. So if a university says we don't want an investigation, that's when they get their federal funds revoked, not if the investigation.
Thank you, representatives. You may now be muted.
Thank you.
We have time for one more speech. So that was a speech in affirmation. Speakers in negation, please rise. Ms. Pontes, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm the last speech of the round, so bear with me here for another 4 minutes. This is Representative Pontus, of course. And just give me a thumbs up when you're ready.
You're good to go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. In 2017, Milo Yiannopoulos was violently protested against in a campus in Berkeley. His anti-Islam views and anti-feminist views were widely disapproved of. Even in the land of the free, freedom has a price. Guaranteeing free speech has a cost. Firstly, stand with me on the negation because the committee will be too politicized in the future. Now, we've beat to death the fact that this task force will be partisan. But what no speaker has brought up is the conditions surrounding speakers in the future. Senator Lee, you tell us that it's okay that these task forces are conservative leaning right now because the speakers branded as conservative are largely controversial. And that's true. The New York Times on October 3rd of 2018 tells us the majority of the controversy surrounds conservative speakers. But the problem is, when you have a Democratic administration, you aren't changing student attitudes about whether a speaker is conservative. But you do change the task forces that determine whether the speaker is allowed and make the entire legislative bill useless in the future. Senator Sun, you can pass symbolic legislation all you want. The way that this task force is set up doesn't try to fix this issue. It slaps a Band-Aid on the problem that will be ripped off as soon as the political party of the next administration is different. But next, stand with me on the negation as well, because colleges have made significant progress themselves. I'm surprised that we've gone towards the end of this debate without talking about our current state of controversial speakers. The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education recorded 43 disinvitations when the alarm over campus free speech was at its height in 2016. But they recently explained that that 43 number has gone down to 9 incidents in 2018. The rationale behind this is because colleges have begun to adopt legislation designed to protect campus speech. In fact, the Niskanen Center in January 25th of 2019 tell us the number of institutions with restrictive speech codes fell to historic lows. This shows us that with protections during events and often a petition process, colleges have been able to avoid angry spats over speakers. This also shows us that current efforts of awareness about this issue have been successful. When I tell you that this legislation, as soon as the administration changes, is completely inexplicable, but passing today's legislation absolutely does nothing. America is touted as the land of the free, but our willingness to secure that risks something much worse.
Thank you, Representative, for that speech of 3 minutes exactly. Questioners, please rise. All right, between those standing, it'll first go to Miss Maher.
Hi, Senator Pontes. So you talk about essentially the partisanship in the task force, right?
Yes.
All right, so why is that such a big problem? Like, I'm on your side, but why does that even matter at the point where these individuals won't even—
Okay, it makes the entire legislative bill useless because a majority of the speakers blocked are conservative. As soon as you put a Democratic task force, they don't advocate for their rights.
Senator Pontes, I'm asking you when it will ever be used. If colleges don't want to forfeit all of their federal funding, they're not going to invite any controversial speakers.
I mean, I'd argue that like specific colleges still do it. I told you that 9 colleges do it, and simply because you're
9
revoking
colleges isn't enough to—
Representative Cox.
So you say the task force is bad because it changes with each administration, right?
Yes.
Can the same be applied to the Supreme Court?
I mean, sure, yes.
So then why don't we throw out the Supreme Court too?
I mean, I'd argue today's legislation is so inefficient because when you change it to a Democratic task force, they don't protect conservative speakers.
But task force have to be appointed by someone, right? The bias is always—
Yeah, they're appointed by the administration, which a Democratic administration won't
Thank you,
protect
Representative.
speakers.
You may now be muted. I'm now going to automatically call for orders of the day and move the previous question. All those in favor of passing this legislation, please hold your placards to the screen. All right, that'll first go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's going to be 8. And all those that wish to negate, please hold it to the screen. That'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Any abstentions? There shouldn't be any. On a vote of 8 to 8, it boils down to me. I feel like passing it, so we're going to pass legislation. We did more than what Congress usually does in one day. With that being said, we had over 30 speeches. I want to thank the chamber for being as efficient as possible. We took a risk with the gavels, but it worked out for us. It was a little bit hard POing all of you, so I apologize if there were errors. We had over 72 questions, questioning blocks, and I would like to thank everyone for doing a great job, and I would like to thank TOC especially for giving me one last chance to compete in my last year.
Very good. Thank you for your service, Mr. Fatmi. So, overall, to all of you guys, congratulations again on making it to the TOC semifinal. It is a huge honor to be here. And I do want to commend you guys on one special thing. It has been, I think, a hard time on so many people across the country right now. And thank you guys for providing a little bit of normalcy to not just each other doing this debate round, but to the judges, to everybody, where it was nice to go back to worrying about speech and debate for a weekend. You guys did a tremendous job, and I really appreciated being your parley. I do hope I can say that I was like the first parley to like parley an entire round outside. So that was cool. I made history books, but overall, you guys were the real superstars. You guys were awesome. I really enjoyed it. Thank you guys. Tab will be releasing results as soon as they can get them to you guys. But no matter what happens, congratulations again. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Yeah, see you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you to the judges and parley. Sorry if there were any
Thank
mistakes.
you guys for judging.
No worries.
Good job, everyone.
Great job.
Yeah. Okay, are we good to leave the room to do our ballots?
Yeah, you guys are good.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Hey, oh, okay. Is there anything else needed from me? I assume not. Okay.